Chapter 21 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 21 News of Minna. I did not reply to Baron Heckscher for a few seconds. It was obvious, of course, that matters had taken a new turn, and I sat thinking how to use the situation to Minna's best advantage. "Now that you are reasonable, we will go back a little way," I said deliberately. "What do you mean by asking me my motive?" "Presumably you have some strong motive and some object to gain. Though for the purposes of this interview, as you say, I am willing to call you the Prince von Gramberg, or anything else you like. I have proofs that you are nothing of the kind. Apparently you are an adventurer. Certainly you have been Heinrich Fischer, an actor at Frankfort, and that within a year or two. You were there for several years, and have been identified beyond question. What you were before then I neither know nor care. You have played the part of the Prince von Gramberg, and played it with plenty of dash, spirit, skill, and shrewdness. But men don't do these things for no object. You have run an hourly risk of detection as an impostor, and have certainly rendered yourself liable to heavy imprisonment. Indeed, proceedings are already in course for your prosecution. Why, then, have you acted in this way?" "Those are my private affairs," I answered after a pause, "and until you can disprove my assertion I remain the Prince von Gramberg, if you please." "As you will, your Highness." He gave the title with excellent irony. "I may tell you that when the information reached us, it was at the request of the Countess's only surviving relative that she was removed from your custody." "You mean the Baroness Gratz? I had already suspected her treachery. But you will save much trouble by keeping to the plain truth. Your object was not to get the Countess out of my custody, but into your own, so that while this plot to place her on the throne had apparently been engineered in her interest, it was your work to put forward that scoundrel von Nauheim as her husband, so that when she had been ruined by him she would be impossible as a claimant for the throne. We may as well be frank." He made a movement of anger at this, and then asked sharply, "If what you say of him be true, how did you know it?" "We may pass that by," I replied, with a wave of the hand. "Sufficient that I did know him. To save her from such a fate has been my motive." "You have aimed high, young man, but the Countess Minna von Gramberg's hand is not for an for the present, Prince von Gramberg." He made the change of phrase with dry significance. "She herself quite understands that." It was my turn to start at this. "You mean that what you have said has been told to her?" "Your tone is enough to show me my information is correct. You will be wise to abandon that idea once for all. Neither her title nor her wealth is for a nameless adventurer." His words stung me deeply, as no doubt he intended they should. "If you knew—" I began, but then checked myself in the act of blurting out what I myself might afterwards repent, and said instead, "If you knew my real plans, you would see the futility of pursuing this any further." "That is why I asked you what your plans are. What are your terms? Most men have a price. Name yours, and I'll see whether we can pay it." He spoke with cold deliberation. "My terms are the safety and immediate liberation of the Countess." "They are impossible at the present juncture. Impossible." "Very good. Then we resume matters precisely where they were when I entered this room," I replied, and rose as if to leave. "You have been playing for a big stake, and I have shown you it is out of your reach. The girl is nothing to you, unless she has succeeded in winning your valuable heart. But you are no fool to waste your strength in chasing the unattainable. Give her up. Name your own terms in money and position. Enlist on my side, and whatever you ask you shall have." "I am not for sale," I answered indignantly. "Then you will be a fool, that's all. You have said enough to me here, coupled with the fact that you are what I know you to be, to warrant me in clapping you into a jail straight away, and I will do it, believe me, if you force me." "If you like to sign the death warrant of the Duke Marx in that way, you can. I have not come here to you without knowing you and preparing for eventualities. Your part in all this is known to others beside me, and I leave you to judge where you, or those joined with you, would benefit if there were no Ostenburg heir to take the throne. Berlin would have to bring back the madman, or put the Countess Minna on the throne, or some stranger, and in either event your power and influence would be gone. But you know all this well enough. Clap me into jail, as you say, or have my head cut off if you like it better, but how would it help you? No, Baron, you will have to try something else. The cards I hold are too strong for you." I flung the words at him with a reckless air, and he knew the truth of them. After a moment he replied: "You mean you will keep to your mad plan of marrying the Countess Minna?" "I have said nothing of the sort. My object is merely to free her from a position of danger from those against whom alone she is powerless to fight. It has been part of your infernal scheme to ruin her, to take her life, or to shut her up somewhere for the rest of it, because she interferes in some way with your plans." "And you wished to put her on the throne in spite of us?" "She has no more wished to become Queen of Bavaria than to become one of your kitchen wenches. You have known this throughout. She has always been against it, and it was only for the purposes of your own double treachery that you would not recognize it openly. Give her the chance and she would renounce all claim to the throne at this very instant. But you would give her no opportunity. You used her to mask your own hidden scheme, and you have always harbored a design against her safety. And now your own precious scheme has failed, as it deserved to. She has been your victim throughout, just as that infamous von Nauheim has been your abominable instrument. Where is that scoundrel now?" I cried. He paid no heed to the question, but was wrapped in thought for some seconds, and seeing yet another development opening, I resumed my seat. "Can I believe you?" he asked at length slowly. "You can please yourself." "It might be possible," he said thoughtfully, and as if half communing with himself. "You say your terms are that the Countess be at once released. What use will she make of her liberty? Or rather, what use will you make of it for her? If she is released, when will the Duke Marx return to Munich? And where would the Countess Minna be?" I saw his drift in a moment. You mean, will I undertake that she is away long enough for this scheme of yours to go through even now?" "You can put it that way." "I must see her for myself before I answer." "Even that might be practicable," he replied cautiously. "I will see." "Where is she?" "If this is done and she is willing, do you pledge yourself to get her away out of the country for the present?" Something in his accent and tone roused my suspicions, and I watched him very closely as he added: "And further, that the Duke Marx shall return to Munich as soon as she is at liberty?" "The Countess Minna's fortune must be secured to her," I said, speaking more to gain time to think than with any real care for the money. "You are cautious for a young man in love," he sneered. "But you need have no fear on that score. You will not lose that." I saw his object then pretty fully. He perceived that a marriage with an actor and adventurer such as he deemed me would help his plans for the Ostenburgs at least as much as a marriage with von Nauheim. Everything could go forward with his scheme. Minna would be out of the way even as he had planned, and she could still be used as a stalking horse to cover his great object, and thus the Duke Marx would be called to the throne, apparently without having plotted for it. There was one obstacle that I saw: von Nauheim. "What of von Nauheim?" I asked. "Where's he?" The answer was a wave of the hand, as though such a consideration were beneath serious notice. "Is he with the Countess Minna now?" I asked, my face growing dark. "He met with some sort of accident last night, it seems," he said, with a shrewd glance at me. "But for that he might have been with her, by the desire of Baroness Gratz. But as it is," he added, with another hand wave. "I don't regard him so lightly," said I, in reply to the gesture. "You have already had to face much more serious obstacles." I could not choose the terms then. I can now. But I will take the chance of what I may do. I can almost pledge myself for the Countess, unless you have undermined my influence with her. That is your lookout. But if you set her free at once, and she consents, I will pledge myself to let your scheme go on as you desire, and will see that the Duke Marx is back in Munich as soon as the Countess Minna is safe out of the clutches of your agents and across the French frontier. There's no time to lose," I added, rising, for the thought of seeing Minna had filled me with eagerness. "What guarantee have I that you will do this?" "None. What can you have? Except that the sooner I have shaken myself free from this infernal intrigue, the better I shall be pleased." The sincerity with which I said this appeared to satisfy him, for after a moment he rose to end the interview. "And where shall I find the Countess Minna?" I asked. "She had better not return to Munich. She can join you at Gramberg." "Thank you, I prefer to fetch her myself," I interposed quickly. "There is a difficulty," he began thoughtfully. "Then the sooner it is smoothed away the better," I interrupted. "I will send you word where to find her, but first there are certain matters which must be set straight." "I don't trust your agents, Baron. You had better understand that. What is to be done must be done to day." I am as anxious as you can be for haste. There is more to apprehend from delay than you appear to think. At any moment we may have some interruption from Berlin, but I can say no more now. If you return to the Gramberg house and hold yourself in readiness to start, I will communicate with you at the earliest possible moment. I can do no more. At this instant I myself do not know the exact whereabouts of the Countess. She was taken last night to Herr Schemmel's house, close to town here, and early this morning was to have been removed, almost directly after your visit indeed, of which I was, of course, informed, and was to be taken to his country seat near Landsberg. But until I know that she has arrived there it would be folly for me to send you out. Those who have charge of her are to use their discretion as events may require." "I will wait till I hear from you," I said, and as a last word asked, "You say she has been told that I am not her kinsman, the Prince von Gramberg?" "Certainly, and probably the tale has been garnished with abundant details. The Baroness Gratz is no friend of yours." "And von Nauheim?" "If he is well enough, he may have gone after them. I cannot say." "If there is any wrong done to her, I shall set it to your account," I cried passionately, for this news of von Nauheim filled me with rage. With this I left him, the fear that von Nauheim might even yet be able to deal some treacherous blow haunting me. On my way from the Baron's I called at von Nauheim's house, and there I learned something that added to my disquiet. He had returned home in the small hours of the morning, and after a brief stay in the house had left again, declaring he might be absent for some time. This was to me like oil poured on a roaring fire. "Had your master been hurt?" I inquired of the servant. "Yes, your Highness. I believe he had had a narrow escape in some carriage accident, but he had almost entirely recovered, and happily no serious injury was caused. He was bruised, of course, but seemed much himself again this morning." This was ill news enough, and I gnashed my teeth in impotent anger when I reached the house and had to sit kicking my heels in idleness while I waited for news from the Baron, and that at the very hour when, for all I knew, von Nauheim might be forcing his abominable attentions on Minna. Late in the morning, toward noon, something happened that increased my uneasiness. A letter was brought me from Minna. It had been hurriedly written, and was scarcely coherent. "Cousin Hans, I am in sore trouble and fear. There is no doubt I am in the hands of the Ostenburg agents. They tricked me at the ball, and I am being taken away from Munich. My Aunt Gratz is with me, and it seems that Marie was false and told everything, though I scarcely distrust her. That is one story. Another is so dreadful I dare not think of it. They dare to tell me that you are not my cousin, but a spy paid by the King's party to cheat us all and wreck the whole scheme. I don't believe it. I would trust you against the world. I do trust you, but I do so long to see you face to face again and hear from your own lips that all this is false. I believe I am being taken to Landsberg to the country house of a Herr Schemmel. Aunt Gratz says so, and thinks you could come after us. She will get this letter to you. Try and follow me at once, and save me from I know not what. All this is killing me. Your distracted cousin, Minna. What on earth could this jumble mean? The Baroness Gratz the medium of news of this sort? First assuring Minna that I was a rascally spy, and then suggesting that I could follow and rescue them. Of course it was treachery somewhere. Was it to put me off the scent altogether? Were they being taken to some other place? It baffled me, and I could not see a solution. The fact that von Nauheim had recovered, and, as I knew, had followed them, led me to connect him with the business in some way. But how? The thought was so maddening that I was raging and fuming at the delay in hearing from the Baron Heckscher when, to my further surprise, Praga was announced. He had come, he told me, to consult about the disposal of our hostage, the Duke. I turned for a moment with relief from the bewildering puzzle of Minna's letter to ask him his news of the Duke. Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 22. At Landsberg. Praga was in his customary devil-may-care humor, and in reply to my earnest request for information, he laughed and showed his teeth, tossed his head and shrugged his shoulders, and his first answer was a volley of his strangely phrased oaths. "Safe so far, Prince, but it was a devilish tight place you put us in. That fellow of yours, von Krugen, is true grit, by the devil, a good fellow right through." "What have you done with the Duke? Don't waste words, man," I said, with much impatience. "Poor little beast!" exclaimed the Corsican, with an ugly laugh. "We had to frighten him till the sweat stood thick on his forehead, his teeth chattered, and his knees knocked together like loose spokes in a rickety wheel. In truth, we didn't know what to do with him, and I was half for knocking him on the head to be done with it, but von Krugen wouldn't. Then it occurred to us that we could play at being about to put him to death, and as von Krugen was in his fancy dress, we let him play the part of his mad Majesty's executioner. We patched up a few lies, sewed them together with threats, and trimmed them with plenty of oaths. Told him the whole plot was discovered, that the madman's agents had found it all out, that my lord the Duke was first on the honorable list for having his head chopped off, and that von Krugen had been sent out to give him the happy despatch. It was magnificent," and he laughed loudly at the recollection. "Well?" I cried, the delay irritating me. "Your Duke's a lily-livered wretch enough when it comes to facing cold steel, and I'm bound to say von Krugen looked devilish ugly, and dead set in earnest as, wearing his mask, he drew his sword and gave the little crank 5 minutes to balance up his ledgers with heaven. He was in no mood for that sort of work, as we had guessed, of course, and instead of putting up a few concentrated prayers of the customary strength, he flopped down on his knees and begged us to spare his life, and he grovelled and squirmed and wriggled on his belly, and wept till I could have spat on him. Faugh!" and the Corsican's face was a picture of disgust. "I begin to see," I said. "Not quite," said my companion with a laugh. "For the next act was that von Krugen and I quarrelled, and we pretended to wrangle and jangle until I seemed to gain my end, and the little fool thought he owed his life to me. He clung to me and shrank from the executioner, and was altogether in a fit stare to promise anything I told him in order to save his skin. I told him it would cost von Krugen his life if it were known that he had not done the work, and that if anyone had even a suspicion of who the Duke was, and who we were, all our lives would be sacrificed in a twinkling. By that time he was about wet through with fear, so we told him he must consent to be thought a mad patient of ours whom we, as doctor and attendant, were conveying to an asylum. In this way we took him to Gramberg. Not to the castle, but to some place where von Krugen said he would be safe for a time. There he is, awaiting your instructions. He's safe enough for a few days, but what after?" "You have done well and cleverly," I said warmly. "A little fright won't hurt him, and meanwhile matters here have taken a turn which may render it necessary for us to set him free in a few hours." And I told Praga what had happened, except as to the discovery of my imposture, and the tale made a considerable impression on him. "When that wily old Iscariot says one thing, I always look for another meaning. But you had a master card to play. He must have been mad. And what will you do?" "If I do not hear from him at once I shall go on to Landsberg on the chance of my cousin's letter being right, and I will send a messenger to the Baron at once." I was in the act of ringing for a servant when one entered to tell me that Baron Heckscher was waiting to see me. "He had better not see me," said the Corsican. "There is no need. I will go to him. Meanwhile, get ready to go with me, and communicate with von Krugen to keep the Duke where he is until he hears from me." Then I hurried to the room where Baron Heckscher was waiting. "I deemed it best to come to you myself," he said on my entrance. "I have been delayed because I wished to be able to assure you that others are with us in what we propose. Further, there is very important news." "Stay, if you please," I interposed. "Before you tell me any more of your news, understand I am not and will not be a party to any of your schemes. I have no wish to be in any degree in your confidence." I guessed that the purport of his news was that some sort of interference from Berlin was threatened, and I had the strongest reasons for keeping clear of any complications whatever in that direction. "I don't think I quite understand you," he said sharply. "I mean that up to this point you have been working against the Countess Minna and myself, and I against you. So far I have outwitted you, and you are taking the present step of freeing the Countess because you can't help yourself, not in any spirit of cooperation with me, but under pressure from me, and because, if you don't, you know that your whole plan will be spoiled. We are still opponents, and I decline to be associated with you and your colleagues, and I retain complete freedom of action and entire liberty to explain exactly the circumstances under which this new development has taken place." "You mean that you have threatened to murder the rightful heir to the Bavarian throne," he said, harshly and angrily. "That I have taken less shameful steps in regard to one of the heirs than you took in regard to the other, precisely," I retorted. "If you will not act with us, there must be an end of things, then." "Yes. If you mean that I must act with you, I will have no hand in your plot." "You make needless difficulties." "On the contrary, I make no difficulties. I refuse only to be drawn into your plot, or to be considered as one of you." "A sudden development of scruples under the circumstances," he sneered. A proper development of caution, I prefer to call it, seeing that I am acting as the only real representative of the Countess Minna, and am dealing with those who have tricked her so abominably. I spoke with all the warmth I felt. You wish to pose as my enemy? I am quite indifferent. I know already the whereabouts of the Countess from a source independent of you, and I have taken means to ensure her safety. This was not strictly accurate, but it was indirectly true, for I knew that so long as the Duke Marx remained in my hands, Minna was safe enough. He paused to think. Do you mean you wish to break away from the arrangement we made this morning? Not so far as the renunciation of the throne is concerned, but the arrangement as to my cousin's freedom is to be considered as forced from you, not made in complicity with you. I do not wish you to tell me anything because you think I am acting with you. I am not. So long as you do what you've agreed, I ask no more, he answered, with a shrug of the shoulders as though he considered the matter not worth discussing. But I knew his indifference was only assumed to cover his chagrin. The news is that the greatest haste is now imperative, or everything will be lost. The Duke Marx must be back in Munich to-night or at latest to-morrow. The whole city is in an uproar, and if the Duke is not back, the ill consequences may be irretrievable. Moreover, I have news of action from Berlin. You mean you wish to pull the wires at once for an agitation in favor of your Duke, I suppose, but dare not until you know he is at liberty and able to come forward. A very pretty dilemma, and I smiled. I am in luck, it seems. But now what of this Landsberg business? The Countess is there. What have you done? I have wired to our leader there, Major Gessler, to expect you to take away the Countess, and I have written you an authority to him that will do all you need. Give him that. You will know him, for you saw him last night when you visited the town house of Herr Schemmel, and that very moment the Countess will be placed in your hands. Good! I cried gladly, my blood warming at the thought of Minna being again in my charge. But you know that von Nauheim has gone to Landsberg. A frown crossed his face, but with an impatient wave of the hand he exclaimed, "He can do nothing. Now as to your part. As soon as the Countess is in your care again, you will hand to Gessler an authority to set the Duke Marx at liberty?" "Yes," I replied after a moment's consideration. "Then the sooner you are en route the better," he said, rising as he spoke. "I have no more to say to you. We part as—" "As we met, opponents, Baron Heckscher," I answered promptly, and as soon as he had gone I hurried back to Praga to tell him what had occurred. Within a few minutes we were driving rapidly on our way to Landsberg. My heart was beating with pleased anticipation of seeing Minna, though I was not without some apprehension as to how she would take the news I had to tell of myself and of the deception I had practised. Nor was I altogether free from disquieting fear that in some way there was danger to her from the presence of von Nauheim. I had, too, many plans to make regarding our future movements, so that I was in no mood for conversation. Praga began to beguile the journey by attempting to tell me a number of piquant and characteristic anecdotes of his experiences, but he soon found I was not listening, and he then relapsed into silence, and sat smoking furiously. Once, when he broke a long silence, His words chanced to chime with my thoughts, and I answered. "When am I to have my revenge on that brute von Nauheim?" he asked, his dark face lowering with anger. "You have had much of it already, for most of his plans have miscarried." "Aye, but I want to be face to face with him, with nothing between but a couple of sharp swords." And his eyes flashed as he spoke. "That may come sooner than we think. I care not how soon," I said. "But I do. Body of Bacchus, but I long to see him squirm and shiver and shrink when I fix his eyes with mine and press his sword with the touch of death. I have a score to settle with him too, and it grows in the waiting." "My turn first. You can have him when I've done with him, or at least what's left of him," he cried, with a callous laugh. "Not before. And what are you going to do afterward?" "I am still undecided," I replied, and again we were both silent. The journey was a very tedious one, for the train was slow and we were much delayed owing to a breakdown of the line, which made our train several hours late. The delay fretted and galled me, for I could not make sure that von Nauheim would not use the interval for some devilment of his own. My impatience made the time pass with wings of lead. It was well toward evening when we reached our destination, and then came another delay. There was an 8-mile drive to the house, and at first we couldn't get horses. After much difficulty we procured a couple of riding hacks of very indifferent quality, and as soon as we were mounted we pushed forward at such speed as the nature of our beasts would allow. The effect of the comparatively rapid motion through the air was exhilarating and braced me. It was dusk, however, when we reached the village at the far end of which was the mansion. "At last!" I exclaimed as we turned in through a pair of massive gates and rattled up the drive at a quick trot. As I glanced at the great, grim square building, in which scarcely a light was to be seen, a thought that all was not right was put into words by my companion, who exclaimed with an oath: "I don't like the look of this place, Prince. I seem to smell something wrong. I am not for trusting myself inside." "It's all right," I answered. "It must be. There's no object now to be gained by playing us false." And I jumped from the saddle and ran up the broad flight of steps to the front door. "Maybe," growled Praga, "but I'd rather stay where I am. I'll turn horse-minder. If it's a trap, it's as well for one of us to remain on the outside of it." I was not sorry for him to do that, as I did not wish Minna to see him until she knew how he had been helping us. His name was too repugnant to her in connection with her brother's death. My summons was answered at once, and I asked for Major Gessler. I was shown to a room at once, and as the door closed on me I heard a rush of footsteps, a cry or two of anger, a shout from Praga that we were betrayed, and then the quick gallop of horses down the drive. Before I had recovered from my consternation, the door was opened again quickly, and an officer appeared at it, accompanied by a couple of men who covered me with their guns. "What is the meaning of this?" I cried angrily. "Where is Major Gessler? I am the Prince von Gramberg, and am here with an authority from the Baron Heckscher to the Major. You will repent this attack, sir, whoever you are." If you will be glad enough to hand over any weapons you may have, and to sit down quietly here," pointing to a chair, "I shall be glad to answer you." "I'll see you damned first!" I cried in a blind rage, and I whipped out my revolver and levelled it point blank at his face. "Stand out of my way, or I'll shoot you like a dog." He was as cool as though I was merely offering him my card. "You will gain nothing by shooting me, except that my men will promptly shoot you," he answered. "Then tell me what the devil you mean by this outrage," I said, and despite my rage I saw readily the truth of what he said. "I allow no man to force me in this way," he answered calmly, looking me steadily in the face. "Give up your revolver and no harm will be done to you. Indeed, I shall be glad to explain matters." I tossed the pistol on the table, and he picked it up, handed it to one of the men and ordered them to leave the room. "Remain at hand to come if I call," he told them. Then to me he said, shutting the door, "I am merely obeying orders. Major Gessler is away for a time, and my instructions were to detain you until he returned." "Why is not the major here? He was prepared for my coming by a telegram from Baron Heckscher." "You must put your questions to him. I only obey orders. But there has been some ugly business here in regard to the Countess Minna von Gramberg. She left the place secretly with her aunt and the Count von Nauheim about 3 hours ago, and the major is gone in pursuit of them." The news set me on fire. "I must go after them!" I cried. "Don't try to stop me. Where have they gone?" "My orders are that you remain here," he answered stolidly, "and I cannot disobey them." "But I have come to fetch the Countess. This is the authority to Major Gessler to deliver her up to me," and snatching the Baron's letter from my pocket, I handed it to the officer. He took it slowly, examined it carefully, and held it out again. "It is addressed to my superior officer. I cannot open it," he said, with the same deliberate coolness. I tore open the envelope and gave him the letter. He shook his head. "It is not for me. I cannot read my superior's letters. I could not act upon it if I did." "But, good God, man, these women may be in desperate peril. You must read it." He shook his head again with dogged obstinacy. At that I lost all control of myself, and with an oath I threw myself upon him to drag him out of the way of my escape from the place. He clung to me and wrestled furiously, and with a call brought in the 2 men, who soon overpowered and forced me back in my chair, fuming with rage. "It is useless to struggle," he said in his cold, even tone. "I have my orders, and more than enough strength to see that they are obeyed." I recognized the force of this, and though I cursed the blockhead stolidity of the man, I could do nothing but yield. I ceased to struggle, but felt like a madman in my baffled fury and fear for Minna. Heaven alone knew what use von Nauheim might make of this opportunity. Chapter 23 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 23 The Pursuit. "Will you cease to resist if my men leave you?" asked the officer after I had been quiet some time. Yes, but I shall hold you responsible for the consequences of this detention of me, and they may be heavy and serious," I replied. "I am only acting under orders," was his answer, and he signed to the men to withdraw again. "I am sorry you have compelled me to resort to force. It was not my wish." "How long will Major Gessler be?" "It is impossible to say. He may return in 5 minutes or in 5 hours. I can have no idea." "He knew that I was coming?" "Obviously, for I was told to expect you and detain you when you arrived." "Told to lay a trap for me, you mean?" He made no reply. "Did your instructions include the unwarrantable attack I heard being made upon my companion?" "My instructions were to detain you, and I must really leave all explanations to my superior." "Then I wish you'd leave the room as well," I retorted curtly; and to my surprise he took me at my word and went out immediately, giving a command in a tone loud enough to reach me that the men stationed outside the door were to remain there. As soon as I was alone I resolved to escape by the window. I got up and stole softly to it. It was shuttered, but the fastenings were on the inside, and as I tried them gently and slowly I found they were easy to release. But I knew the men outside the door would be on the alert, and that the least noise I made would bring them in. I sat down again, therefore, and began to make a noisy clatter with some of the furniture. I banged the door of the big stove, upset a couple of chairs, and threw down some things from the table. As I stooped to pick them up, one of the men put his head in at the door. "Well, what the devil do you want?" I cried, with an angry scowl. "I thought you called, sir," he answered. "That's a ready lie, my man. You came because you heard a noise. That was the noise." And I picked up a chair and threw it across the room at the door. "Just hand it back, will you?" He picked it up and placed it near the door, and went out, and I heard him mutter something to his companion about my being a queer sort. I slipped to the window then, and not being afraid of making a noise, I unfastened the shutters to find the catch of the window, and was in the act of undoing that when I heard steps approaching the door across the hall. In a moment I replaced the shutters, slipped back to my chair, and was yawning heavily when the door was opened and the officer came in. "They report to me that you have been making some disturbance here," he said shortly. "I will, therefore, leave a man in the room with you." I cursed the clumsiness of my ruse, which had thus frustrated the chance of my escape. "I decline to submit to such an indignity, sir," I said angrily. "I will have no jailer here." But my protest, like everything else with this wooden idiot, passed unheeded, and one of the men was told to stand by the door inside. For a moment I was in despair. My first thought was to try and bribe him, but I abandoned the idea as readily, for I saw that if I failed he would report the attempt to the officer, and I should be in a worse plight than ever. Yet the thought that time was flying, and von Nauheim getting farther and farther away with Minna, while I was condemned to this helpless inactivity, was like hell to me. Then a last and desperate scheme suggested itself to me. The room was lighted by an oil lamp, and my thought was to try and extinguish it and escape in the consequent confusion and darkness. I knew now that in a moment I could open the window. Keeping up my character for eccentricity, I jumped to my feet so suddenly that the man started and grasped his weapon, and declaring that I was cold, though the evening was stifling and my rage made me as hot as a fever patient, I began to stamp up and down the room, taking care at first to keep well away from the window, lest he should suspect my object. Next, I declared that the lamp smelled vilely, and I set it down near the stove, and opened the little door that the fumes might escape up the flue. My next step was to whip the cover off the table and throw it around my shoulders. The man kept his eyes steadily on me, obviously regarding me as more than half insane, but he made no attempt to interfere with me, and I continued my monotonous march backward and forward, until I noticed that his vigilant watch was gradually being relaxed. Then I altered my direction slightly, until each turn took me nearer and nearer to the window, and at last I prepared to make my effort. "Turn that lamp down a bit, it stinks," I said, with a vigorous grimace of disgust, and without in the least suspecting any intention, he went to do it. For a moment his back was toward me, and at that instant I snatched the cloth from my shoulders and threw it with all my force at the lamp, enveloping both it and the man as he was bending over it to do as I had requested. He shouted lustily for help, but there were a few seconds of darkness before any one could reach me, and I tore back the shutters, opened the window, leapt out, and dashed away through the darkness at top speed, running in zigzag fashion for the cover of some shrubbery about 50 yards distant. Before I reached the cover I heard the sounds of great commotion in the house, and a number of men started out in pursuit of me, but I plunged through the bushes at as great a speed as possible. The noise I made would, I knew, render pursuit an easy matter, and thus when I gained a small clearing I changed my direction and raced across the lawn, taking my chance of where I was going. Fortune favored me, and I came upon a boundary wall, over which I climbed, dropping breathless and excited, but free, into a deep, dry ditch by the side of a lane. I lay down to regain my breath, and to listen for any further signs of pursuit, as well as to think out my next step. I had escaped, but what use to make of my freedom I could not for a moment tell. Presently I heard the sound of a horse cantering on the turf by the side of the lane, and looking up cautiously I saw, by the light of the moon, which was shining brilliantly, a man riding toward me. As he came closer I recognized, to my infinite pleasure, that it was the Corsican Praga. I scrambled out of the ditch and stood up to wait for him, calling to him when he was some 20 yards away. He reined up and jumped from his horse. I told him my experiences with that dolt of an officer in the house, and he told me that he was just riding back to see what had become of me, and that he had news. "It is great news," he said. "When they tried to get at me, I galloped off, and in the village I stumbled against an old Munich acquaintance, who is here over his business, and was just coming back from a start he had made with Major Gessler. He told me something of what had happened here to day. It seems that that brute von Nauheim got wind that something was going to happen which he didn't like. I suppose it was your coming, and he bolted with the Countess Minna and her aunt. At that, Gessler seems to have thought treachery was in the wind, and that you were in some way connected with it. These officers are always fools, especially when someone tells them about half the truth, and he set out after the runaways and left orders that if you did come you were to be kept. I was coming back to try if I couldn't find you and perhaps get you out of the house, so that we might start in pursuit on our own account. Where has von Nauheim gone? Does anyone know? I asked. Yes, the major's on their track, I think. They are supposed to have taken the south road, von Nauheim's object being apparently to strike the railway when some miles out, and presumably get out of Bavaria as soon as possible. I have no horse, I said. You had better give me yours, and then try to get one and follow me as soon as you can. I am on fire. I cannot wait. It's not much of a beast and very tired, but it may serve till you can get a better, said Praga. Make for Waal first, and then try to find some traces and leave word for me where I am to follow. I think I can find your horse. He followed me out of the place and I tethered him up somewhere about here. I mounted, and after a few more hurried words from him about the direction to be taken, I clapped my heels into the horse's ribs and set off at a pace that was as near a gallop as the tired brute could imitate. The clattering of the beast's hoofs on the rough, uneven road woke the echoes around me as I dashed forward, filled with the one consuming thought of rescuing Minna from the hands of the dastard who had carried her off from me. I found to my dismay, however, that my horse was quite incapable of any great effort, and soon began to show signs of fatigue. I had to ease him constantly, and after a few miles I could not urge him beyond a rather slow trot. To get another horse appeared difficult, and I did not pass any place that even offered a hope of one. My progress was thus irritatingly slow, and every mile I covered seemed to detract from, rather than to add to, the chances of my overtaking von Nauheim. I had no difficulty, however, in tracing the fugitives. Major Gessler, in company with 3 other men, had passed scarcely 2 hours ahead of me, and as they had made inquiries all along the route, they had left a broad trail easy enough for me to follow. If they were on the right track, it was certain that I was. After riding for a couple of hours at this slow pace, I saw a mile or 2 ahead of me the lights of a small town, and in the hope of being able to get a fresh mount there, I urged on my shambling steed to the utmost of his powers. But he was quite used up, and as I was forcing him down a slight hill, I felt him stagger and stumble under me, and then down he went in a heap, throwing me clear of him. I could not afford to waste time over him, and as soon as I had managed to drag him to his feet, I tied his head to a tree by the wayside, and set out to finish the remaining distance to the town on foot. I had not walked more than a few hundred yards, however, when I discovered that the fall from the horse had shaken me considerably. I turned dizzy and reeled and staggered as I walked. I kept on as long as I could, but at last, despite my burning impatience to get forward, I was compelled to sit down by the roadside and rest until the feeling passed off. How long I sat there I don't know, but I think that for a short time I must have lost consciousness. The rest refreshed me, however, and feeling almost myself again, I jumped to my feet quickly, eager to resume my journey. As I did so, I was startled by a low cry, like an exclamation of fear, from some one close to me, and by the moon's light I made out the darkly dressed figure of a woman some 20 or 30 paces ahead. I had been sitting in the shadow of an overhanging tree, and no doubt my sudden appearance had frightened her. She stood looking at me irresolutely, and when I commenced to walk toward her, she turned and sped away on the grass by the roadside noiselessly, in the hope, no doubt, that I had not seen her. Obviously she wished to avoid me. She was nothing to me, and as I had no wish to add to her fright, I let her go, and merely watched her as she ran. I had no other feeling but curiosity, tempered with regret that all unwittingly I had been the means of frightening her. She had nearly passed out of sight when I heard her cry out again, this time a louder and shriller cry, and I thought I saw her trip and fall. I went after her then as quickly as I could, and found her kneeling on the ground moaning, with her hands to her head. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "I am afraid I frightened you. I trust—" I stopped in amazement, for she turned her face quickly to me, and the next instant I was down by her side with my arm around her. It was Minna herself. "Oh, Hans, is it really you? I'm so frightened. Save me!" And without another word she let her head sink on my shoulder, while she twined her arms around me in quite hysterical fear. "Hush, my child, you are safe now," I said gently, in the soothing tone one might use to a child who had hurt itself. And I held her in my arms in silence, my heart too full for words, as indeed hers was, with mingled fear, relief, and agitation. "Where are you hurt, Minna?" I asked after a time. "Let's see if I cannot help you." "Don't leave me! Pray don't leave me!" she whispered, clinging to me more tightly than ever. "I shall be better in a moment. Now I am safe. I was running away from you. I was frightened when you jumped up suddenly in the road, and I fell and hurt my head. Don't leave me. I want to realize that I am really, really safe." "Don't doubt that. None can hurt you now." I would have added many a passionate protestation in my excitement, but I checked myself, remembering all that I had yet to tell her. I let a longer interval pass before I spoke again, for though I was burning with impatience to learn how she came to be in this way alone on the road, and to take means to get her to some place of safety, I could not resist the thrilling delight of feeling her arms about me and her head nestling confidingly against my breast. The mere touch of her was an ecstasy of passion. "Let me see your hurt, Minna," I whispered. "We have a long journey before us." At that she started and began to tremble again, and said, her lips faltering as the words fell from them: "I had forgotten everything when I felt your arms around me. But he will follow us. We must hurry on. Where can I go to escape him?" "You mean von Nauheim?" I asked, my face frowning at thought of him. "Oh, there is so much to tell and to ask. What does it all mean, Hans? I am not much hurt. It is here," and she put her hand to her forehead, which was bleeding slightly. "I struck it against a stone when I tripped and fell, I think. And to think I was running from you of all the world." I could not answer the tenderness of her tone, or the love that breathed in every syllable of the words. If I had tried, the passion that was pent in me must have come rushing out. I sought to affect indifference, therefore, and though my fingers trembled as I touched her face, and my heart ached at the sight of the little wound, I dressed it in silence and bound it up with my handkerchief. She smiled to me several times as I did this, and when I had finished she murmured, lifting her eyes to mine: "It will soon be well now you have touched it, cousin," and she sighed. But the next instant she started, and a look of fear showed on her face. "I can hear the sounds of a horse at full gallop. I have been hearing nothing else in imagination for the last 2 hours, but this time it is real." She spoke very wildly. I listened intently, but could hear nothing. "It is only imagination still," I replied. "And if it were real it would mean nothing. Listen!" And she put up her finger and strained her ears. She was right. She had caught the sound before me, but now I could distinguish the beat of hoofs in the far distance. "I hear it now. Which way is the sound from?" I asked. She began to tremble and clung to me again. "It is from that way," pointing in the direction from which I had come. I listened again, and again found she was right. "Good!" I exclaimed. "It will be Praga. He is following me." "Praga! The villain who killed Gustav! Oh, Hans, it is true then that you are in league with that terrible man? I would not believe it when they told me." And she moved away from me as she spoke, and stood at a little distance, trembling. But it was only for an instant. I had no time to reply before she came again to my side, and clung to me as before, crying with quick agitation: "I did not mean that, cousin Hans. I did not mean anything in distrust of you. I trust you altogether with my whole heart and soul. If he is with you, I know it will be not that you help him to do harm, but that he helps you to do good. I know that. Believe and forgive me for shrinking away like that. But I have always had such a dread and loathing at his mere name, for dear Gustav's sake. Oh, there is so much to be made clear." "It will all be clear enough to you when I have told you my story," I said in as unmoved a tone as I could command at this fresh proof of her absolute confidence. "And that will be as soon as we can get out of our present plight. Even Praga has been wronged, and in this matter at least he is with us." After that we stood in silence listening to the now fast approaching gallop of the horse. Then came to our ears the whinnying of another horse. The galloping stopped. The horse was pulled up short. "What does that mean?" asked Minna in a whisper of alarm, for all sounds breathed the language of danger in her present agitation. "I left my horse tied to the hedge some distance behind there, and Praga has found it, I expect." Almost directly after that Minna started again and cried: "There is another horseman coming from the opposite direction. That will be Count von Nauheim." "It is luck that Praga is close at hand, then," said I, "for I have no arms. It will be a dramatic meeting." And now Minna was pressing close to my side again, and in this way we stood and listened to the more distant horseman's approach, and heard also the man I judged to be Praga bring his animal back on the hard road and set off at a sharp trot toward us. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 24. The Meeting. If Minna was right in her conjecture that the horseman coming up on our right was von Nauheim, it was easy to foresee that the meeting between him and Praga would have an ugly ending. I knew well enough that the Corsican's fiery hatred of the Count would urge him to take his revenge on the spot, and for the moment I was a little at a loss how to act. Praga was now close to us, riding slowly and peering anxiously on each side of him for any traces of me. Obviously I had better let him know that I was at hand. Minna and I were standing close under the shadow of a tree whose low branches concealed us effectually. "Stop here while I go to speak to him," I said in a low tone. "No, no, don't leave me," she urged, holding my arm in a nervous clutch. "Have no fear. It is not you who needs to fear now, but that villain von Nauheim, if it is indeed he coming up the hill." "Don't go out of sight then, cousin. I can't help being afraid, except with you close to me." I whispered a word of reassurance and stepped out from the shadow of the tree into the moonlight and went toward Praga. "Who is there?" he called, stopping his horse. "It is I, Praga, the Prince." "Well met indeed. Is that your horse tied to a tree back there a bit?" "Yes, he fell and threw me, but I am all right. Quick, bring your horse on to the grass here and under this tree." And I led him into the shadow of the tall hedge. "Have you any traces of them?" he asked impatiently. "Yes, I have the best news. I have found the Countess Minna. She has escaped from that villain, and I believe that the horseman you can hear coming up the hill now is the man himself, coming in pursuit of her." "Ah!" he drew in his breath. "We are in luck indeed. There is a good light," and he glanced up at the moon, and I heard him swear into his moustache and mutter, "At last." Then, after listening a moment, he said, "He is breathing his horse up the hill. He little guesses who's here to give him a welcome. I'll go forward and meet him. I hope to God he has a sword with him. Will you stay here? You can act as a second for us both, and see that all is fair, though it would serve the dog right if I were to shoot him down without a chance." He walked his horse slowly forward on the grass, making no noise, and keeping out of sight in the shadow of the hedge. I went back to Minna. The oncoming horseman was now in full sight of us on the slope of the white hill, the moonlight showing up the figures of both horse and rider as he turned to look behind him and sat listening intently. The silence was so intense that we seemed to feel it, and even the creak of the saddle leather as he turned reached our ears. Then we saw him face around quickly and dash his heels into his horse's ribs as if to gallop forward, but at the same instant he caught sight of Praga, and he checked his horse again almost as he was in the very act of urging it forward. The next moment Praga was at his side. For a second neither spoke. Then, through the still night air, we heard the Corsican laugh. "You're riding late, my lord, the most noble Count von Nauheim," he said in a mocking tone. No answer was made, and Praga put in words the thought that flashed upon me. "Don't think of trying to escape. You won't do it this time." He spoke sternly, adding in the previous mocking tone, "And what brings you out for horse exercise at this uncanny hour, most noble?" The reply was sudden and unexpected by me, but not by the Corsican. Von Nauheim drew a revolver and fired point blank at Praga, and then dashed his heels into his horse's sides and tried to make off. But the other was fully prepared for the maneuver, and when the noise of the shot, which frightened Minna excessively and woke the echoes of the woods round us, had died away, I saw the Corsican had grasped the bridle of von Nauheim's horse in a grip of steel, till the beast swerved around and nearly unhorsed its rider, while with his other hand Praga had struck the revolver from his opponent's grasp. Then he laughed again. "A hand is rarely steady when a man's shivering with fright," he said in his bantering tone, but he changed it swiftly, and in a voice deep with passion he cried: "Get off your horse, you coward, or I'll drag you from your saddle. Do you hear?" Von Nauheim made no reply and no effort to dismount. "Do you hear me? Dismount!" thundered the Corsican, his deep rolling voice vibrating with wrath, and when von Nauheim still hesitated, Praga bent forward and, with a strength that surprised me, tore him from his horse and forced him to the ground. Von Nauheim seemed helpless with terror. "What is he going to do?" asked Minna, shivering. "We must wait," I answered. Praga dismounted then, and tying the reins of the two horses together, led them to a tree and fastened them. Every action was done with cool, methodical purpose, which I knew was carefully calculated to increase the other's fear, and though the Corsican pretended not to watch the latter's actions, I could see that the whole time the dark, dangerous eyes were taking the keenest note of every gesture and movement. When he had tethered the horses, he crossed the road back to where von Nauheim stood in an attitude of sullen dejection. He was like one fascinated and paralyzed with fear. All at once I saw Praga start and glance in my direction, as a thought seemed to occur to him. "Come," he said in a voice of rough command, short, sharp, and stern. "This way," motioning along the road toward the spot where Minna and I stood. I wondered what he meant to do. Von Nauheim did not move, and Praga, seizing him by the arm, half led, half dragged him forward. "You can do an act of justice for once in your life." He clipped the words, and followed them with a short, sneering laugh, a curious mixture of humor and anger. "We are not alone here, and I have a fancy that you shall tell what you know about the death of young Gustav von Gramberg." At this von Nauheim looked up and stared rather wildly about him. I saw Praga's motive then, and was glad. "Halt, most noble and honorable of counts!" he cried, when they stood about 20 paces from us. Then, in a rough, stern tone, he added: "Now, tell the truth, the part you played in it." At that von Nauheim made a sudden dash and a struggle to get free from his antagonist's grip, but he might as well have tried to get away from his master, the devil, as from the iron hand that held and then shook him till his teeth chattered. I guessed that he had caught sight of us. "Now the truth," cried Praga in a truly terrifying tone. "Out with it! You know me by this time." The other glanced about him in abject fright, and then said, in a whisper hoarse and husky with agitation, "Are you there, Minna?" "Silence!" thundered Praga, shaking him again. "Speak what I have told you, no more, no less." For a time von Nauheim tried vainly to find words, and the sight of his fear was so appalling and repulsive that Minna clung closer to me and hid her face against my arm. Another threat and command came from Praga, and then, in a voice that shook and quavered and broke again and again, he began the shameful story of his own abominable part in the intrigue which had led to the duel between Minna's brother and the Corsican, and the latter would not let him halt until the whole villainous tale was complete. It took a long time in the telling, and I could feel the girl shrink and wince as the truth came out in the dreary, monotonous voice of the terror-possessed wretch. "Take me away, cousin Hans, I cannot bear this," she cried to me piteously. "My poor, poor brother!" "Yes, we will go," I said. "But it was right for you to hear the tale, and to know who in reality played the villain's part in it." I led her out in the moonlight then, and told Praga that we should go. "As you will," he answered. "I will follow. Take my horse, and I'll do the best I can with yours." In turning to speak to me he loosened his hold somewhat of von Nauheim for an instant, and the latter, with what sounded like a great sob of fear, broke away and threw himself on the ground at Minna's feet. "For God's sake, don't go away, Minna! Don't leave me with this man! He will murder me! Have mercy on me! Plead with him for me! You can save me, Minna! Do you hear? For God's sake, have mercy!" And he caught hold of her dress and clung to her, the type of broken, abject, fright-becrazed cowardice. "Don't touch me!" she cried. "Your hands are red with my brother's blood." "Get up, you crawling, unclean brute, and cease your whining," said Praga, dragging him to his feet. "Don't let him be killed, cousin Hans," whispered Minna. "He is not fit to die. But oh, take me away! This scene is killing me," she cried in distress. At that von Nauheim broke out with more pleas and entreaties, his voice shaking as he trembled in his fear. I did not know what to do. I had promised Praga his revenge, and in all truth I could see no reason for interfering to save the man's life. He had played the scoundrel all through, and if ever a man deserved death, he did. But at the same time it was Minna who asked for mercy, and I loved her for it, and my heart was moved by her appeal. I stood thus in hesitation, when an interruption came which, for the instant, I welcomed gladly. We were to have more company on that lonely spot, and we all four heard at the same moment the sound of horses coming quickly up the hill. A minute later we caught sight of a couple of figures in the moonlight. The effect on von Nauheim was electrical. He sprang up and gave a loud shout for help. "Help! Help! Murder! Help!" The cry rang over the countryside, and awakened 1,000 echoes in the still night air. An answering shout came from the approaching men, and they dashed headlong toward us, reining up their horses almost on to their haunches. "What is this?" cried a voice which I seemed to recognize. "Who called for help?" "It is Major Gessler, Hans," whispered Minna. "Take care." While I was assuring her that all was well, and that I had an order to him for her release, Praga was answering him. "You come in excellent time, gentlemen, whoever you are. This is the thing that screeched for help," pointing to von Nauheim. "Ah, the Count von Nauheim," said the major in a tone of satisfaction. "There is the lady you seek, Major Gessler," said the poltroon, pointing a trembling finger to Minna. "And I call you to witness that I have been stopped on the highway by these two men, and my life threatened. I claim your protection." The major looked from one to the other of us in indecision, and then the Corsican laughed a deep, rolling laugh of contemptuous anger. "By the nails that pierced the feet, you are a paltry thing!" he cried. "Nothing's too vile and base for you to save your dirty life, is it? A minute since you were grovelling to the Countess Minna, hanging to her skirts and begging her to save you, and now you think to try and curry favour with Major Gessler by this lick-spittling attempt to betray her. But you don't know him, lily-liver. He's the last man in the world to step in to prevent an affair of this kind. This is an affair of honour, Major, if we can use that term with a man like this, and of course you will not think of interfering, except to see that everything is done duly and in good order." There was a significance in his tone which did not escape me. "I must first learn the reason of your all being here, if you please." "I was returning to—" began von Nauheim, when Praga cut him short. "Silence!" he thundered. "You will only lie." Then to the major he said, "I know no reason why I should explain my conduct to you." "I can best explain this, I think," I said. "The Count von Nauheim had induced or compelled the Countess Minna here to leave your custody, and after some time she escaped from him. I was following, and by the happiest of coincidences we met. She will now remain in my care. Signor Praga was riding after me, and the Count von Nauheim came up soon afterward in search of the Countess. Between Signor Praga and the Count there is an old quarrel, and it was in course of arrangement when you arrived." "Then you will return with me, Countess?" said the officer. "On the contrary, as I have already said, my cousin will remain in my charge." And I handed him the letter from Baron Heckscher. He read it by the light of the moon, and we waited in silence till he had finished. "You are to hand me an authority to your agents," he said as he folded up the letter. "I have also to demand an explanation for the treatment I received on my arrival, as I understood by your instructions," I answered sharply. "It can all best be done at the house itself. My work is finished here, and I must set about this other matter of the Duke Marx without delay," he said. Count von Nauheim has also an explanation to give me. We had better proceed to the house, Prince." At this, Praga showed signs of restiveness, while von Nauheim agreed eagerly. "I have a word to say about that," exclaimed the Corsican, intervening. "I have brought this fox to earth, and have no mind to see him slip through my fingers. Prince, you won't forget your compact?" "I shall be responsible for the Count's custody," put in Major Gessler. "Maybe, but you have an unfortunate trick of letting your prisoners slip the leash," cried Praga bluntly. "I shouldn't trust myself in that house again, Prince, if I were you. There may be more treachery there." "Those are ugly words, sir," exclaimed the Major hotly. "They describe an ugly fact, Major," returned Praga recklessly, with a shrug of the shoulders. "I am not concerned to pick my words to tickle your ears. If you don't like them," and he threw up his hands, "I can't help it." "I need not give you my assurance, I trust, Prince von Gramberg," said the officer, turning to me, "that so long as I am at that house your personal safety and that of the Countess Minna will be absolutely secure." "If I doubt it, you have only the acts of your own men to blame," I answered curtly. "That can be explained. When the Countess Minna was taken away by this—" he was going to say gentleman, but substituted "by this Count, I feared that some further plot might be afloat, and I left instructions that you should be detained until my return from my search for her. If my men exceeded their instructions in any way, I had only time to give them very hurriedly. I beg to tender you my sincerest apologies. But at least the Countess here will tell you that while she was in my care, complete regard was paid alike to her comfort and safety." "Certainly I would trust Major Gessler's word," said Minna. "Will you return to the house?" I asked. "Yes, if we have his word that we are to be at liberty to leave it. But I would rather go to Gramberg." "I pledge you my word on that," said the Major. I reflected that we had better not go to Gramberg until I had had an opportunity of explaining the whole position to Minna, and, in fact, I had another plan in my thoughts. But while this conversation had been taking place, and our attention had been engrossed, von Nauheim had stolen unobserved to the place where Praga had tethered the horses, and having cut the reins which tied the two together, he leaped on the back of his own and made off down the road at a hard gallop. With a furious oath Praga ran to his horse, caught it cleverly, jumped into the saddle and dashed after the fugitive in mad pursuit. The Major told the man who was with him to follow, and we stood and watched the wild race, as the three streamed down the hill from us at unequal distances, along a flat stretch of level road at the bottom, and then up a long incline beyond. Praga was the better horseman, or had the better mount, for we saw him gaining fast on the dark figure in front, and then as they neared the top of the incline we heard the report of a pistol shot, followed at a short interval by another. A moment later the two leading figures passed out of sight, and we were left to conjecture what had happened. "Had you better not push on to the house?" asked the Major. "I will ride back and see the result. It has an ugly look. I shall probably overtake you before long." And with that he wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving Minna and myself alone again. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 25. I am not the Prince. "I think we had better return to that house," I said to Minna. "My horse is close here, and you can ride while I lead him. You must be worn out." "I will do whatever you think best. I believe Major Gessler is to be trusted." "Yes, I think so now. I have given him an order from those for whom he is acting that you are to be detained no longer." "How did you find out where I was?" she asked. "I am longing to hear everything." "You had better have some rest first. There is much to tell and a weighty decision to make. Let us start." I led the way to where I had tied the horse, and having unfastened the reins, I walked him up and down once or twice to see if he showed any signs of lameness as the result of his fall, and whether he was fit to carry the girl. He appeared all right and much the fresher for the rest, so I lifted her into the saddle, and taking the rein in my hand, started on the return journey. "You can tell me as we go along what has happened to you since the ball," I said. "It has been a terrible experience, but it is simple enough to describe. In the crowd at the ball I got separated from Captain von Krugen, and someone just like him came up and said we had better stand out of the throng a minute, and when we had moved away he added that you wished me to be in the ante-room instead of the ball-room. I suspected nothing, of course, and went with him, and then some people came pressing around me, and someone said that as a matter of fact they had bad news to break to me, that you had met with an accident and were seriously hurt, and wished me to go at once to you. I did not hesitate an instant when I heard that, and so I fell into the trap. You don't blame me?" "Blame you for being solicitous about me?" I asked, turning and glancing up to her with a smile. "But it was a cowardly scheme, and had you not seen me in the ballroom?" "Yes, of course, and I said so, but they told me it had happened only a few minutes before, and that you had been carried at once to the house of a doctor, where you were expecting me. They told me you might die, and at that I was so eager to get to you that I would have gone anywhere." She paused again here, but this time I would not trust myself to look around. "In this way," she continued, "I was lured into the carriage, and after that, of course, I was helpless. They took me to some house near Munich, and the place seemed alive with armed men. There, to my surprise, I found Aunt Gratz, who told me that Marie had betrayed us all, and that I was in a trap. I felt at first glad in a sense, because I knew then that you were not hurt after all, but presently I grew angry, for she began to tell me all kinds of horrible things about you. I will tell you them some time. And then my anger passed. I was nearly broken-hearted, for as all our plans were known to the others, I was afraid, horribly afraid of what might happen to you, and what mischief my foolish credulity might cause you. It was a time crowded with terror." She sighed. "And after that?" I asked, wishing her to finish her story before I began mine. "In the early morning Major Gessler sent word that we were to prepare for a journey, and then we thought of writing you. I should not have thought it possible, but Aunt Gratz suggested it, and said she was sure she could get it delivered to you. I wrote it then readily enough, But what I said I do not know. I scarcely knew at the time. It must have read like a wild, incoherent cry, for that's what it was." "How did you know you were coming to Landsberg? I have been much perplexed by your letter, why your aunt should have spoken in this way of me in regard to it." "I am afraid I can give you the clue. She knew about Landsberg, she seemed to know everything, and from what I have heard to night, she was acting in collusion with that man. His object was, as I know now, to let you have the clue where to follow us, so that he could draw you into a snare, for some object I am almost afraid to think of. But something happened to interfere with the plans." "I know what that was. He learned probably from Major Gessler that I was coming to Landsberg direct from Baron Heckscher, and probably there would be some special reference to him in the Baron's message." "That may have been it. At any rate, he came to us in a state of great excitement, declared that he had found out a plot to kill me, that you had communicated with him, and that we three were to set off at once to meet you at a place he named. I forgot its name. I was suspicious at first, but when he declared that there was to be a clear up of everything, and a complete understanding between us all, and that all they had said about you was not true, and when Aunt Gratz joined in persuading me, I consented. We got away secretly, and I was glad indeed to leave. They all appear to have known that with me your name was the one argument sure to prevail," she said softly. "It has led you into plenty of perils, Minna," I replied. "But it will lead me out of them again. You have done it already, and I do not care now what happens. It is good to have some one to trust, and best of all, to be with him." She paused and sighed contentedly, and then exclaimed, "But why don't you say something? I have not done wrong, have I?" What could I say if I spoke at all, but turn and tell her that this trust in me was just the sweetest savor that could be put into my life, and that to hear it from her own lips was enough to set every pulse in my body beating fast with my love? But yet I could not speak this until I had told her all from my side, and so I gripped the bridle rein the tighter and plodded on through the moonlight, keeping my face resolutely turned from her, lest the sight of her beauty and the knowledge of her trust should burst the last bonds of my self-restraint. "No, you have done no wrong, Minna, but tell me the rest." She waited a second and then continued. "In the carriage to night the truth came out. Aunt Gratz and he quarrelled, and with a sort of blunt, brutal frankness he blurted out the truth that we were flying from, not to you, and that he was carrying me away to make me his wife. In his mad rage against you, he heaped all kinds of abuse on you, knowing that it made my blood boil. He is a villain." "He has paid for his treachery by now, probably," I said, and then there came a longer pause. "Don't you wish to hear any more?" she asked gently, as if anxious to make me speak to her, and when I told her that I was only too eager to hear it all, she went on: "I thought it best to say nothing, but I made up my mind that I would slip away and seek any one's help rather than stay with them. My great thought was to get back to the house at Landsberg, and I sat as if prostrated with grief and waited, watching for a chance. It came at last, at a town where we stopped to change horses, and he got out of the carriage. There was some delay, and I saw him enter the house. and Graz was half dead with fatigue, and lay back in the carriage and fell asleep. I opened the door on my side very softly, and slipped out, without disturbing her, and then ran off in the thick dust for my life. I was soon missed, of course, and should not have escaped had it not been that there was a wagon standing not far away, though out of sight of those in the carriage. There was no one in it, and I jumped in and hid myself among some hay and sacks that lay in the bottom. I lay concealed there a long time, and heard the hue and cry raised, and people searching for me, though no one thought to look in the wagon. Presently the wagoner came, and we started off at a slow pace. I let him go on for a few miles, and then to his intense astonishment I rose up suddenly from among the sacks and told him I would give him money if he would take me toward Landsberg. Poor Minna, what an experience for you! I did not care then, for I was free from that man. The wagoner was a good fellow, and, though I did not know it, we had been coming in this direction, and he sent me down about a mile from here, where his road turned off. I walked on to be frightened again, but this time by you, and then to feel safe, oh, so safe again. You did splendidly, I cried warmly, for her pluck and resource had been admirable. And then I walked on in silence, thinking how best I could commence my confession. "Can you hear sounds of any one coming?" she asked. I stopped the horse directly and stood listening. Turning my head, I glanced in her face and saw a smile there. "I hear nothing, do you?" I asked. "No, I didn't expect to. She stopped. "You what?" "I've seen nothing but the back of your head for 2 miles, I should think, at the least, and I thought perhaps the horse might need a rest." It was a little act of coquetry after all. "He must be a sorry beast if he tires in carrying such a burden," said I, smiling. "But we have come half the distance, I think. You haven't much farther to go. Aren't you tired?" I was standing close to the saddle, and she looked down into my face without speaking for a while. Then she said: "I was thinking, cousin." The pause before the use of the word and the emphasis upon it told me she had more than her usual meaning. "I can guess your thought, I believe," I said. "Well?" "You were wondering whether you are right to still call me cousin." "I don't believe what they told me," she replied quickly, for I had guessed her thought. "What did they tell you? No, I won't ask that either. I will tell you freely all that has to be told." I paused an instant, and suddenly the clean, clear moonlight which flooded everything so brilliantly seemed to turn chill and fear laden for me. The horse moved restlessly, striking the ground harshly with his fore hoof. I stroked his neck to quiet him and left my hand on the crest of it. "Well?" The question was asked softly and gently. "It is hard to tell it," I answered in a low and rather unsteady voice. "To me? Are you afraid of me?" And I felt a hand placed on mine. "It is hard to speak words that may divide us, but I have deceived you. I am not your cousin. I am not the Prince." I felt the fingers on mine start and tighten for a second, and then close in a warm, trustful pressure. "Can I make the telling easier for you? I had made up my mind that that was so, but the rest— Who are you? Don't tell me unless you wish. I trust you none the less. You remember I told you days ago— How long it seems! You had a secret and that I saw it. Now I know part of it, and I'm glad of the knowledge— not glad that you are not my cousin Hans— glad only that you have told me. But I am eager for the unknown part. I could not beat down my feelings to speak coolly, so I waited to fight for my self-control. They told me only one thing that should be hard for you to tell me, and that I know was untrue, she continued, as if it were a pleasure to bare her heart to me. That you were not true to me, but seeking to betray me. I would have laughed at the absurdity if the malignity of such a slander had not maddened me. "No, I have been no traitor to you," I answered readily. "That I can declare from my soul. But I have kept this knowledge from you. Even that I would not have done, but that I could not see how else I could go on helping you. I could do nothing unless men thought I was the Prince." "Yet you could have trusted me," she said, with a gentle sigh of reproach. "Had I told you I could no longer have remained at the castle. It was not that I did not trust you. Indeed, I longed to tell you, not only that but all the rest." "The rest?" she repeated softly in a low voice that trembled, and again I felt her fingers on mine start. "Yes, the secret at which even you did not guess. I can judge pretty much what else people have told you, that I am an adventurer and an ex-play actor. There is a secret behind that which I have not shared with a single soul on earth, but I will tell you." Then I told her plainly of my meeting with von Fromberg, the mistake under which I was first taken to Gramberg, and the chain of circumstances which had kept me from breaking silence as to my identity, and had seemed to drive me into accepting the part that had been thrust upon me. I did not dwell too strongly upon the one motive that had influenced me, the wish to save her from the plot against her safety. But she was quick to read it all, and maybe her feelings for me prompted her to give it exaggerated importance. She listened almost in silence, merely asking a question here and there when some point was not clear, and at the close she sat thoughtful and said sweetly: "It means a great loss to me, and perhaps a greater gain." I looked up with a question in my eyes. "I have lost my cousin, it seems, surely the truest cousin that ever a woman had, but then I have gained a friend whose stanchness must be even greater than my cousin's, for there was no claim of kinship to motive his sacrifices for me. But, cousin or friend, you are still—" She did not finish the sentence. "Still what?" I asked. I think she was going to make some pretty quip in reply, for I saw a smile half mischievous and all witching on her face. But reading by my looks how much store I set on her answer, she said earnestly: "The one man in the world who has proved himself as true as steel to me, and whom I trust with my whole heart." "You may," I answered, with an earnestness equal to her own, and my hand, which was resting on the horse's neck, turned and sought hers, and pressed it in a strong, firm clasp. "Whatever happens," I added, "I can at least be your friend, and I will." We stood thus a while, our heart thoughts in close sympathy, till she started and lifted her head. Those quick ears of hers had caught the sound of a horse's hoofs approaching from behind us. "Someone is coming. You have not yet told me something. How am I to call you, and by what name to think of you?" There is still a longish story to tell, and I will tell it all to you; but for the present we must keep up our play of cousinship until the truth can be safely told. That will not be long now. And then? But there, I do not wish our cousinship to end. I am glad to know so much, however. Every time I say cousin, I shall think of this talk to-night. I took the horse's bridle again then, and led him on, for the sounds of the hoofs behind us were growing clear and distinct, and we did not speak until Major Gessler rode up to us. "You have not got so far as I expected, Prince," was his greeting. "I am afraid I seemed to leave you rather in the lurch." "This horse of ours was tired, and we stayed a time on the road," I answered, not without a slight feeling of embarrassment. We should probably have reached the house at Landsberg but for the long halt I made in telling my story. "But what is your news, Major?" "They are following," he said briefly, and he made a sign to me that something very serious had occurred, which I judged he did not care to tell before Minna. She saw the gesture and read it also. "Have they fought?" she asked. "No, there was no fighting, but the Count von Nauheim has met with a serious accident, very serious." He thought evidently that any ill news in regard to him might need to be broken carefully to Minna. "You may speak plainly," I said. "Is he dead?" "Yes, he is dead. When he ran off in that way, and Signor Praga after him, the shots we heard were fired at the Count's horse by his pursuer. His object was not to kill the man, but to prevent his escape. Both shots missed their aim, however, and then he determined to ride the man down. On the brow of the hill, where you saw them disappear, comes a straight bit of road for a couple of miles, at the end of which is a steep, dangerous hill. Both men rode like madmen across the level, Praga, who is a splendid horseman, gaining steadily all the time. Finding that he was being caught, von Nauheim began to punish his horse mercilessly, and when they came to the steep descent the poor brute seems to have stretched himself for a final effort to answer the call on him. For a moment he raced away from the other, but when about half-way down the hill he collapsed suddenly and dropped like a stone. So frightful was the speed at which they had been going that horse and rider rolled over and over several times in an almost indistinguishable mass. Praga, who was not far behind, had great difficulty in avoiding them and in checking his own horse. When he went back to von Nauheim he found him dead. The stirrups had prevented him from getting free when the smash came, and the horse had fallen on him and rolled over him, breaking his back and crushing the life out of him. He was a horrible sight. "I am glad Praga didn't kill him," I said, "but I can't say I'm sorry he has met his death. He deserved it." The others made no reply, and we held on our way without speaking. The officer rode on the other side of Minna, and the silence of the night was broken only by the sound of the horse's hoofs, the major's being restive, and breaking now and then into an amble. "Do you know much of Signor Praga, Prince?" asked the major after a long silence. "Not enough to speak of him," I replied shortly, and the effort at conversation closed as abruptly as it had begun. When we had covered a couple more miles, he said he would ride on and prepare for our arrival, and I was not sorry to be quit of him. "It is a terrible end," said Minna thoughtfully, referring to von Nauheim. "A more merciful one than he deserved," said I. I could find no pity for such a scoundrel. "He has been a traitor all his life." "He is dead," said the girl gently. "But he lived too long. Years ago I would have killed him had he not run from me." "You knew him years ago?" "And never knew anything but ill of him. It was because of my knowledge of him that I stayed on at Gramberg. That is part of the story I have yet to tell you." "When?" she asked eagerly. "To morrow. I would tell it you now, but we are close to the house." And a few minutes later we turned in at the lodge gates, and were winding our way through the high shrubs which lined the drive for more than half the way to the mansion. When we reached the house an old motherly woman came forward to receive Minna and take her to her rooms. The girl stood a moment and put both her hands into mine, with a gesture she had used once just after my arrival at Gramberg. She was thinking of it too. "Do you remember my telling you at Gramberg how I trusted you?" she asked, leaving her hands in mine, and looking into my eyes. "I could never forget it," said I, speaking low. My instinct was very true, wasn't it? I knew, and after tonight I trust my friend more than I even trusted my cousin. Good night, friend and cousin. Good night." A slight shade passed over her face for a moment, though a great light was shining in her eyes, and she waited as if I should say more. "Good night, Minna," I whispered. And then she cast her eyes down and blushed, and after standing thus for the space of perhaps 5 seconds, she took her hands gently out of mine, glanced once rapidly into my face, smiled, and turned to the woman, who was waiting at a distance. "Be up early, cousin," I called to her in a tone of assumed indifference, as if anything about her could be indifferent to me, "for we must make our plans." "I am quite as anxious as you," she replied, but the real answer was with her eyes, which reflected the thought beneath my words, that I should be all eagerness till the time came for us to meet again. Chapter 26 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 26. Flight. As soon as Minna had left me, the major brought the officer to apologize for the conduct which had so exasperated me on my arrival. The man had of course exceeded his instructions, and although the explanation did not by any means make amends for what I had endured, it was tendered in good faith, and I accepted it. I was in no mood to harbor anger against any one. What I most wished now was to be alone to recall the scene with Minna on the road, the ineffable sweetness of her voice, the soft tenderness of her looks, and the magic thrill of her touch. When the major asked me my plans, I answered almost at random, for my thoughts were away back with the darkly robed figure on the horse, looking down on me with a light in the eyes which it filled me with sheer ecstasy to believe had been kindled by the torch of love. I pleaded that I was vastly fatigued, and then went to my room, to lie tossing from side to side like a love-mad loon, grudging even the hours to sleep, because I should not be able to think of Minna. I was in truth crazed with the knowledge that she loved me, and when I awoke in the morning, for sleep conquered my silly resistance, it was with just the same fevered longing to be with her. Yet I had plenty to think of and to plan, and when I forced myself to think that even now, though things had gone so well thus far, there was much to do before Minna's safety was secured, I began to think rationally and connectedly. As I stepped into the fresh morning air, I found Praga out before me, pacing up and down in heavy thought. He had not been to bed at all, but was like iron, and seemed as fresh as the morning itself. "I was thinking of rousing you, Prince," he said. "What about the Duke Marx? That best of good fellows von Krugen may be getting anxious." "I can say nothing yet, but I think my purpose is accomplished, and that I shall send you to him with an order for the Duke's release." "What!" he cried in a tone of astonishment. "Throw it all up when you have the game in your hands? A couple of days' firmness, and the Countess will have the throne as surely as I know how to whip a sword from its scabbard. You're not turning chicken-hearted, surely?" "You do not understand matters," I said shortly. "Understand? There's not much wit needed to understand this business. I know enough what the people think and want, and what a bold coup would do at this crisis, and if ever a woman had a crown at her feet, and for the mere picking it up, it's the Countess." "Maybe, but matters are as I say. I will give you my decision later." "I hope you won't let yourself be ruled by a woman's tricky fears. There's danger that way, too. Once give these Ostenburg folk the power, and you may whistle for your chances of any safety. I wouldn't trust one of them. What will you do?" "I have not decided," I repeated, and it was evident that my apparent vacillation mortified him. But the mood passed in a second, as did most moods with him, except revenge, and he laughed. "Well, of course, it must be as you please. It is your game, not mine." And he waved his hand as though the matter were settled. Then he asked with another change of tone, "And about the burial of that carrion von Nauheim?" "Where's the body lying?" "In the shed of a cottage nearest to the spot where he broke his miserable neck." "I will leave directions here for the funeral. There will be some sort of inquiry, and you may have to be present as witness. But I don't suppose any of those who have used him will take much heed of his death, and probably Major Gessler will be able to make all arrangements." Later on I discussed this with him, and he agreed to see that everything the authorities might require should be done. "If you're giving up things you'll have no more need of me, I suppose?" asked the Corsican after a pause. "You put it bluntly," I answered. "I hope, of course, that all these complications are nearly over, but if you will let me I shall wish to see you about your future. But for you I could not have carried this through, and I shall not forget that." "I never take too serious thought about what you call my future, Prince. If I killed the brother, I've helped to save the sister, and if she knows it, that's enough for me." He said this with as much earnestness as I have ever observed in him, save in his moods of furious passion. But he lapsed into his more customary temper immediately after, and added, Besides, I've had my revenge, although I'm sorry I didn't run the brute through before he had the luck to break his neck. To the close of my life I shall regret never having had him to play with at the end of my sword." At that moment Major Gessler came out of the house, looking very serious, and called me aside. "I have very grave news from Munich, Prince," he said. I noticed that he was now always very careful to give me the title which I think he knew did not belong to me. "Last night the Kaiser's confidential adviser, von Augener, arrived there from Berlin. The news of this business has caused a big stir in the capital, and the Emperor himself is expected at Munich. The Duke Marx should be there without an hour's unnecessary delay." "Had you held the Countess Minna safe in your charge yesterday, Major Gessler, he might have been there now. It is not I who am responsible for the delay." I spoke firmly, for I resented the too peremptory tone he adopted. "What are your plans, then?" he asked next. "Will you give me the authority for his release?" "I can tell you better an hour hence, when I have seen my cousin." "You must be good enough to give me some definite news to send to Munich." "You can send them the reason for the delay," I retorted hotly. "I decline your dictation, sir, and can dispense with your interference." He was about to reply with equal warmth when Minna came out of one of the windows. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said brightly. "Good morning, cousin Hans." And her face radiant with smiles, she came to me holding out her hands. All my anger fled at the sight of her, and when I held her hands in mine, and read in her eyes the answering emotions to those which were rushing out through mine, I had no thoughts save of peace, gladness, goodwill, and love. "We must speak together at once," I said. "Shall we walk in the gardens here?" I led her to a large, wide lawn, through the centre of which ran a broad path. It was a spot where we could not well be overheard. "I passed the night in wondering what I was to hear this morning," she said. "I think it must be good news, for I was so happy." "You have not slept, then?" "Oh yes, but while I slept I dreamed, and now and then had spells of delicious wakefulness. I don't know which was the better, the dreams that all was right, or the waking beliefs that all would soon be." "I hope it will be," I declared earnestly. "Nay, I am sure it all will," she declared, as if in rebuke of my doubt. "Isn't this a lovely old garden?" she cried. "Not so good as Gramberg, of course, because no place could be so dear to me as that, but yet lovely. And what flowers! Did you ever see such magnificence? And the perfumes, they seem to distil the very essence of peace. And what a change from yesterday! It was a prison then, to day a veritable palace of delight. Heigho, and you have changed it for me. And now for this news. You know where you left off? I do. I think I could repeat every word you said. You are going to tell me who you were before you became Heinrich Fischer, the actor at Frankfort." "I was a nameless wanderer, and went there almost direct from my death and burial." She stood still in the path and looked at me in blank surprise, her face wrinkled in perplexity that was only half earnest, and despite the serious nature of things, her mood partially infected me. "Your death?" she said, in wonderment. "It is all true. Did you ever hear your brother speak of a young Count von Rudloff, in the navy, who was at one time a friend of the royal family, and whose death at Berlin about 5 years ago aroused some comment? It happened almost immediately after the Prince, now His Majesty the Emperor, had met with an accident on board the Imperial yacht. "The Count von Rudloff," she repeated thoughtfully, saying the name over once or twice as though some old memories were partly stirred by it. "I think I did. But what is that to us?" "To me much. Everything, indeed. I am the Count von Rudloff." And then I told her unreservedly the whole of my strange story. Her first comment surprised me. "Is this the story you thought would part us?" she asked. "I had misled you." "Yes, and for a base and cruel purpose, to help me out of my trouble." And she raised her eyebrows as she smiled. "You must judge me curiously if you think I should consider that a cause for sacrificing the truest friend a helpless girl could have. I believe I could almost be angry with you for that judgment." "But my helping you was, after all, only for a selfish purpose," I said after a pause. "What was that?" she asked quickly, all unsuspecting. "I loved you, Minna." We were near the end of the gravel walk and, instead of turning as we had done before, I walked on past some large laurels which hid us from the house. I stopped there and took her hand, which she left freely in mine. "I have told you all now," I whispered. "Your answer?" "This is the happiest day of my life," she murmured. I put my arm around her and held her to my heart. "You love me, then?" Her face was close to me, she was smiling trustfully and lovingly, and the answer came in the pressure of her lips to mine as our hearts met in pledge of our betrothal. After that we stood together there, just a pair of happy lovers, for whom the sun was made to shine and the earth to be beautiful, and forgetting all else save the one immeasurable fact of our avowed love. A commotion somewhere near the house recalled us to ourselves as the sounds floated across to our ears. They broke in upon our love ecstasy, and with a sigh Minna unwound her arms from my neck, and we stood hand in hand a minute. "Better than friendship or cousinship, Minna?" I asked. The glad glow on her cheeks and in her eyes answered me, and I kissed her again. "And now we must be common sense folk, for we have to decide what course to take." "I can make no decision, except that you must not leave me," she said. "Yet we are forgetting you are the Queen." "Do you remember what I once told you would be my first command?" "Your Majesty has been anticipated. I have told you all, and the assembly was certainly a very privy council." "Yes, just Queen and—" She paused, and then, hiding her face on my shoulder, added softly, "and King. I want no other throne than this." It was very sweet fooling, though not very witty, and I would have been glad enough to continue it if I had not seen through the little gaps in the bushes that a number of people had come out of the house and were walking in different directions through the grounds. Some were coming our way. "Let us walk on here, dearest," I whispered. "There are men coming from the house in search of me, I think. And remember, I must still be for the present the Prince, and you my cousin." We moved away then, and walked as if in consultation, and I told her what I thought we had best do. "I do not know how matters will go at Munich," I said, But I hear this morning that the Kaiser himself will see what the trouble is, and that already old von Augener, the Kaiser's own man as they call him, is there making inquiries." "He is the awful man who came to you years ago, isn't he?" cried Minna, with fear speaking from her eyes at the mere thought of danger to me. "Yes, but there is no reason to fear that he will recognize me. I am so completely changed. The more serious consideration is what view he will take of your supposed part in the disturbance, and of my having kidnapped the Duke Marx on your behalf. I told Baron Heckscher that you were only too anxious to resign all claim to the throne, and that I would use my influence with you. It was not so great then as now," I broke off to say. "Oh yes, I should always have done whatever you wished," replied Minna. "It never occurred to me to do anything else." "Well, I told him I thought you would remain in hiding long enough for him to settle matters in the Ostenburg interest, and this coming of von Augener makes me more inclined than ever to advise you to put the frontier between yourself and these plotters." "When shall we start?" she asked instantly. "And then I can watch your interests at Munich." "You do not wish me to go alone?" "Not to go alone. But unless you know of some better place, you might well go to Charmes, to your real cousin, and you could stay there until these troubles have blown over." "And you?" "I shall of course go with you to Charmes, and then return with all speed to Munich to watch matters here." "Why should you go back to face the risks there alone?" "I can do more good for you as well as for myself if I know you are in a place of safety." "We can talk of that on the way. But what should I do now if anything happened to you?" she cried in distress. I loved her for the words, but could not thank her as I would, for at that moment one of the men caught sight of us and came hastily toward me. "Major Gessler is very desirous of seeing your Highness at once," he said. "I will come to the house," I said, and with that we turned, the man hastening on to give my message. "I am sorry to have to press you, Prince," said the major, coming to meet me, "but I am most anxious to send tidings to Munich. Have you made your decision? It is nearly 3 hours since I spoke to you." I saw Minna start with surprise at this mention of the time we had been together. "It has been a complicated problem to discuss, Major," I answered gravely, "but we have decided it at last. The Countess will leave by the first train from Landsberg, and I shall accompany her. At the station I will hand the authority you need to you and Signor Praga." "And your destination?" he asked. "Is our own affair, sir," I returned stiffly. "I merely asked so that I should know when to meet you at the station." And he turned on his heel and left us abruptly. "I can be ready directly," said Minna, and she ran into the house. A few minutes later she returned, and we had breakfast together, in the middle of which a messenger from Major Gessler brought me a list of the chief trains in each direction. I chose the first that started westward, and we set out soon afterward for the station. There Praga was waiting, and I gave him the authority which I had written out to von Krugen to release the Duke Marx, and added in a tone loud enough for the major to hear: "I shall be in Munich to night or to morrow. You can see me there." A minute later the train started. "Now for freedom, Minna. A few hours more and we shall be across the French frontier," I exclaimed. "Did you hear Major Gessler say that we had been 3 hours in the garden this morning, Karl?" asked Minna, blushing and smiling. "Can it really have been so long?" "The time did not fly on the same wings for him as for us," I answered, "and if the next half dozen or so will only speed at the same pace, I shall breathe all the more freely." "And will they, do you think?" she asked demurely, as she crossed from her seat to that next mine. They did, although I had many moments of anxiety. The journey itself was as uneventful for some hours as a tourist's trip. We had the compartment to ourselves for the greater part of the time, though occasionally an unwelcome passenger came in for a few miles, and so broke the thread of our long, delicious talk. But my anxiety began to increase when, as the hot afternoon passed and the cool evening air refreshed us, we began to approach the frontier. I could not put my feelings into words, nor could I see any probable reason to fear interruption. But whenever we stopped I looked out with an ever increasing apprehension I could not entirely allay, and scanned curiously the people standing about on the platforms. As we ran into the frontier station, this feeling quickened up into excitement. A few minutes would see Minna safe, if only there were no interruption. The officials came to examine tickets, then others to see the baggage, and still all was going well. We had no baggage, of course, and sat watching the different effects which that most irritating process of examination produced upon the tempers of our fellow travellers. As the time slipped away, I fast grew easier in mind, and I joined with Minna in laughing at one or two comical incidents. But my laughter died away as I saw a couple of officials walking slowly along the train, scrutinizing all who were in the carriages. On catching sight of me, one of the men started, and drew the attention of a companion, who looked quickly in my direction, and then referred to some papers. The papers seemed to satisfy him, for he called up a couple of men, and all four came to our carriage. "Something's wrong," I whispered to Minna. "Be on your guard." "Pardon me, sir," said the man, bowing, "but I think you are the Prince von Gramberg, and this lady is the Countess Minna von Gramberg?" "Yes, what do you want?" I replied. "I am sorry to incommode your Highness, but may I ask you to alight for a moment?" "How much time is there before the train starts?" I asked sharply. "There will be plenty of time. Will you come to the waiting room, and you, madam, as well, if you please?" "No, I will not," I answered firmly. "If you have anything to say to me, say it here. What is it?" "I regret that my instructions are to detain your Highness." "Let me see your instructions." "Pardon me, I am not at liberty to show them, but I trust you will make this repugnant duty as little unpleasant as possible. It is inevitable." And a glance at the men around him emphasized his meaning. "Where are your instructions from? At whose instigation is this unwarrantable liberty taken with us?" I asked, with as grand an air as I could assume. "I can say no more now than that you must really do what I wish. You will surely see the uselessness of resistance." His tone changed slightly, and he showed a little more authority. Minna had turned very pale, and sat trembling. "We had better go," she said in reply to a glance from me. "I comply, under protest, mind," I said to the official. "I shall hold you responsible for this outrage." He spread out his hands and shrugged his shoulders by way of reply, and when we left the carriage he and his men walked on each side of us to the waiting room. He came in alone with us, signing to the others to stay outside, and he gave utterance to the most voluble apologies for his unpleasant duty. At that moment the whistle sounded, and the train started. "You said there was plenty of time for this to be explained before the train went?" I cried angrily. "Before your train, your Highness, and besides, I wished to avoid any scene. But I am pained to say you must consider yourselves under arrest, and must be prepared to return to Munich by the first available train." Chapter 26. Chapter 27 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 27. An Old Enemy. I saw at once it would be hopeless to attempt any resistance to this new development. My first feeling was one of bitter chagrin and exasperation, mingled with genuine alarm for the consequences to Minna. Who had dealt the blow, and for what object? I knew that I had rendered myself liable to arrest and prosecution for my impersonation of the Prince von Gramberg, although, despite what Baron Heckscher had said, I could not understand who would attempt to set the law in motion. But with Minna it was very difficult. It was certain that the conspiracy with which she had nominally been concerned might carry very ugly consequences, but at the worst any such act would constitute only a political offence against the Bavarian laws, and I did not think that outside Bavaria she could be touched. But we had long passed that frontier safely. Whose hand, then, was this? I recalled, with something of a shudder, the news which Major Gessler had told me, to the effect that von Augener had gone to Munich, and I saw that, if our arrest was made at his instigation, the results might be even more serious than I had anticipated. "I have no intention to offer resistance to this step," I said after a pause of thought. "But of course you must satisfy me of your authority for it." "I am the chief of the police here," replied the official, "and hold full instructions, very full instructions indeed, and very urgent ones. The case is a very exceptional one." "But surely you can tell me the nature of the charge for which you say I am to consider myself under arrest?" "Under ordinary circumstances I could and should, of course, do so, but not in this. I trust you will understand my position." "You have performed an unpleasant task very tactfully, but can you tell me no more than you have, if not officially, then as a matter of courtesy?" "We are not allowed much latitude for courtesy, I fear, your Highness, but I may tell you privately that I have not been informed of any charge against you. My instructions are merely to prevent your crossing the frontier, should you attempt to do so, and to see that you return to Munich, and these instructions, which came first from Munich, have been repeated as urgent from Berlin." "I need no more than that, and will not mention that you told me. We will return to Munich, Minna," I said, turning to her. There was an hour to wait for the train, the man told me, and we filled up the time by getting some supper. It was a doleful enough meal. The police official did his best to make the fact that we were under arrest as little obvious as possible, but it was plain to me that we were kept under the strictest surveillance. "What do you think it means?" asked Minna. "It can scarcely be anything very serious, I think. Probably it is the outcome of old von Augener's presence at Munich, and maybe half an hour's conversation with him will be enough to put things right again. I had intended to see him in any event." I spoke much more lightly of the matter than I thought, in order to reassure her, and I was pleased to see my words had the effect I desired. When the train came in, the police official showed us a carriage and, with another apology for his intrusion, entered it after us. I made no demur, because I knew it would be superfluous. We must make the best of a bad job, and consequently I settled Minna comfortably in a corner of the carriage so that she might sleep through the night. I took my seat opposite to her, and during the whole of the long, wearisome journey I sat wrapped in thought, speculating upon the possible reasons for the arrest, and trying to see the best course to be taken in her interest. I was now disposed to blame myself bitterly, since matters had come to this pass, for not having, in the first instance, abstained from meddling with the plot against the mad King. I had pitted my wits against the men in the Ostenburg interest, and had allowed Minna to appear to be implicated in everything that was done, trusting to my own ingenuity to beat them at their own game. I had done it successfully to a point, but now I could see how, like a fool, I had miscalculated the real effect of this intervention from Imperial headquarters. The flaw in the present situation was one I could see easily enough now. I had neglected to provide anything like sufficient proof of Minna's innocence, her dislike of the scheme, and her disinclination even to think of accepting the throne. I could see now clearly what I ought to have seen at the start, that if Minna had actually left the country at the moment following her father's death, and had openly relinquished all claim to the throne, she would have had an absolutely clean case so far as Berlin was concerned, and if necessary could have appealed there for protection against any effort of the Ostenburgs to harm her. The danger to her from the Ostenburgs, which had then loomed so large in my thought, was dwarfed now by this greater and actual danger from Berlin. How then was I to repair the blunder I had made? There was one possible chance, forlorn so far as Minna was concerned, and almost desperate for myself, but the pith of everything would be now that I should be able to prove beyond question and suspicion the absolute sincerity of my motives, and be able to thoroughly convince the Emperor and his advisers that my version of the facts was the correct one. Everything might turn upon this. As an adventurer who had been known first as Heinrich Fischer, an actor, next as Henry Fischer, an Englishman, and afterwards as Hans von Fromberg, only to change once more into the Prince von Gramberg, I could not hope to be believed. Even this very attempt to get Minna out of the country would be charged against me as crowning offence, while I might rely upon it that every word and act I had spoken and done in the character of the Prince would be construed in the worst light by my enemies. But what if I declared myself in my true character? The question stirred a host of old memories and associations, which came crowding thick and fast upon me, with conflicting force and perplexing contradictions. I lived again in thought the crowded week of my life that came between the scene on the yacht and my supposed death. I could not tell how far that act of expiation on my part had changed the royal feeling toward me, nor on the other hand could I gauge what effect would be produced by the avowal that I cheated every one by the farce of my supposed death. There was one thing on which I thought I could rely, however. There had been many acts of close friendship between the Prince and myself, and on one occasion I had rendered him a service which he declared at the time would make him ready to grant me any favor I should ever ask. I had none too high an opinion of the gratitude of princes, and had never urged any request, while it was more than likely he would consider what had happened since had completely cancelled any obligation. But I was prepared to risk any and everything now, and to exhaust every possible resource to help Minna at this juncture. I had never had such a motive to spare my energies, and I ransacked my memory for incidents which I thought might be turned to help my purpose. I was in this frame of mind when we arrived at Munich, but I had not got much farther in my plans than a resolve to use every means that might offer, regardless of any effect upon myself. Minna awoke, chilled and cramped by the long journey, and the cold grey light of the morning depressed her spirits. She looked pale and frightened as the train entered the station, and we peered out curiously to see what reception awaited us. "Keep a brave heart, Minna," I whispered, and she smiled a rather wan, weary smile in reply. "Where are we to go?" I asked the police official. "I expect to find instructions here," he answered. Then Minna gave a little start and cry of surprise. "There's Aunt Gratz," she said. "What can that mean?" I could make no suggestion, but the reason of her presence was soon clear enough. As we alighted, she came forward. "I should think you are ashamed of yourself, Minna," was her greeting. "If not I am ashamed of you. Thank God we have saved you, though only on the very brink, it seems." "There's no need for you to say that to me," returned Minna warmly. "There's very great need indeed. You have been the victim of this man's villainy." "There has been no villainy, except perhaps that which you and the Count von Nauheim attempted yesterday, and cousin Hans succeeded in foiling." "Cousin Hans, indeed! Poor child, it is only your own obstinacy which prevents your seeing that this man is a wicked impostor who has—" "Pardon me, Baroness," I began when she turned on me. "I will not pardon you, nor allow you to speak to me or the poor girl whom you have so shamefully deceived. You are unmasked at last, and will be punished as you deserve. Come, Minna, you are to come with me." At that moment the police official who had travelled with us came forward with another man, who said: "The countess is to go to her own house here with this lady, and you are to accompany me if you please." "As you will," I answered. At that the tears forced themselves into Minna's eyes, and she came very close to me and gave me her hand. "We shall meet again soon, I am sure of that. Meanwhile," and she raised her head proudly as she looked around at the others present, and said, "I wish all to know that I am your promised wife. You have saved my life, and more than my life, and I can never sufficiently repay you for all you have done. When every one else was treacherous, you were stanch and brave on my behalf. Let them say what they will, I know the truth, and nothing shall ever make me doubt you." I had no words ready for a reply, but I raised her hand to my lips, and with a lingering look into my eyes she went away, her face aflame with her gallant little act of loyalty to me. Then I turned to the man who had spoken to me. "And what is the charge against me?" I asked. "You will learn it to day," he said, with courteous curtness. "Be good enough to come with me." We entered a carriage that was waiting, and drove to the police bureau, the official stolidly declining to exchange a single word on the way. There they gave me breakfast, and afterwards I was left by myself for some 2 or 3 hours. At the end of that time the same man entered the room, for I had not been put to the indignity of having to enter a police cell, and requested me to accompany him, though again he would not say where we were to go. I was not much surprised, however, when I found the carriage approaching the palace, for I had detected old von Augener's hand in the matter. He delighted in secrecy and surprises. I was led through several corridors into an anteroom, where I waited some time until the door of an inner room was opened, and I was told to enter. I went forward, and, as I had anticipated, the first object which my eyes encountered in the room was the hard, stern face of von Augener, whose sharp, piercing eyes looked at me, curiously and menacingly, from under heavy brows I knew well enough. He let me stand before his table for some minutes without a word, and after his first glance at me pretended to be writing. He finished this, and then took up a bundle of papers, which he turned over leisurely. I guessed that his motive was to make me understand by his brusque treatment the change in my position. But I let him understand quietly that it had no such effect on me as he wished. I carried a chair close to the side of his table and sat down, saying lightly as I crossed my legs: "I've had a rather long journey, so you'll excuse me if I sit down until you are ready to commence our conversation." At the sound of my voice I saw him start, bend a sharp, keen look on me, and then appear to dive into his capacious memory for the connection which it stirred. Then he said as sternly and harshly as he could: "This is no drawing-room audience. I don't allow prisoners to sit in my presence. Be so good as to stand up," and he motioned with his hand. "Thank you, but I deny your right to address me in that tone. I am no prisoner, and this is no court. While I am here I demand to be treated with common courtesy." "I will send you to a police cell to learn manners," he cried. "As you please. I would rather sit in a jail than stand to be hectored by you," and I smiled and shrugged my shoulders. Like my voice, the smile appeared to set his wits gleaning for the facts that would piece together the puzzle my voice and gesture had set him. For a moment he seemed as if he would carry out his threat, but I judged he would be much more eager to learn what I knew of the conspiracy than to stickle over the question whether I sat or stood in his presence. And so it proved. "You will dare to carry things with a high hand even with me?" "On the contrary, I am here for the express purpose of discussing the whole of this affair with you in its new light. But I tell you at the outset that if you think to frighten me with threats or to treat me as what you call a prisoner, with the meaning your accent gives to the term, you will get nothing from the interview." "We shall see," he said grimly, but he said no more about my standing up. A long pause followed, in which I saw him look several times at me with obvious doubt and interest, and I knew by these glances that he was trying hard to place me in his memory and failing. "Now, sir," he said at length in a quick, sharp tone, "who are you?" "At present I am generally known as the Prince von Gramberg, but that is not my real name." "A needless addition. What is your real name? Who were you before you were known as Heinrich Fischer, the actor at Frankfort? I warn you to speak freely. Your only hope lies in that." "For the present I prefer not to tell you," I answered very quietly. "It does not concern this matter, in its present stage, that is." "You refuse to tell me?" "If you put it so, I refuse to tell you." "What was your object in usurping the character of the Prince von Gramberg?" I was forced by a series of blunders on the part of others to take the position. It was done by the desire of the real heir of the Prince, Hans von Fromberg, who is now known as Henri Frombe, and I kept up the part in order to protect the Countess Minna from a foul conspiracy against her in which a scoundrel who is now dead was one of the chief agents. And then I told him at considerable length the exact circumstances under which I had been first taken to Gramberg by von Krugen and Steinitz. "You can easily verify what I say," I added. "You mean by those two men who have since been your tools in the affair?" he sneered. "I mean by finding the real von Fromberg and questioning him." Despite his sneer I could see that the story impressed him, and he put a number of questions to test its consistency and truth. "You don't attempt to deny, then, that you are willing to continue the impersonation of the late Prince and to accept the inheritance?" "There were no gains in what you call the inheritance. The only inheritance was the castle of Gramberg itself, mortgaged for a great deal more than its value. Scarcely a valuable price for such an adventurer as men appear to have described me to you. I have my own private fortune, a large one." "There was something else at the castle besides a mortgage," he sneered. "Indeed there was," I replied quickly, purposely misunderstanding him. "There was a mess of intrigue and treachery against the Countess Minna." "And you were the cavalier to save her from it, and for yourself?" The gibe made my blood boil. "That is the sneer of a coward," I cried hotly. "And if that is to be the tone in which you dare to address me, I decline to say another word or to remain in your presence. I am prepared to tell you the whole truth, and to lay bare every word, motive, and act of mine throughout, but I will not allow you or any man to insult me in that coarse and brutal fashion." He laughed coldly. "You use bold terms," he said. "I will back them with acts. Unless you pledge yourself to abstain from further insults, you can send me to jail or to hell itself before I'll remain here." "I'm not accustomed to make compacts with prisoners." "Nor I to hold converse with bullies who forget themselves," I cried, all my old hate for the man fired by his manner and words. I got up and turned to the door. "Come back at once, sir," he thundered. "If you dare to attempt to leave this room, you go straight to a prison." "Rather there than here." I flung the words at him over my shoulder, and went on toward the door. He struck the bell on his table sharply, and the door opened as I neared it to admit two men in uniform. "Will you return here?" he called to me. "No, not without a pledge that you cease to insult me." "Detain that man," he cried to the others, who came and stood on either side of me and laid their hands on my shoulders. I stood with my back to the table. "Face him around," he ordered, his voice thick with anger. The men forced me to turn around. "Now, sir, I give you a last chance," he cried, pointing his finger at me and shaking it menacingly. "I don't accept it," I answered recklessly. I've had enough of this inquisition process. I will have a public trial. I am not ashamed of what I have done, but I should be ashamed of myself if I stayed here to be bullied and browbeaten and insulted and sneered at by you. Do what you like." My recklessness was a factor on which he had not calculated, and I could tell by his indecision how it perplexed him. Without my version of the plot he could not hope to get a full grasp of the facts, and I reckoned that in an affair of such real state importance he would be altogether unwilling to have any public trial. "Leave us a moment," he said to the men, and when they had gone he asked, "Do you mean to persist in this obstinacy?" "Obstinacy! Is that what you call my refusal to be a stalking horse for your ill-conditioned flouts and gibs, after you have had me dragged 300 or 400 miles, and hauled in here that you may treat me like a dog or a thief, without even telling me the charge preferred against me? If that be obstinacy, then indeed I am obstinate, and shall remain so. But I will do more than that. I will appeal to the Emperor himself, and tell him the story to which you have refused a courteous ear." "The Emperor does not concern himself with the private offences of every nameless adventurer in his empire." "I am no nameless adventurer. I bear a name—" I stopped, checked by the cold, steely glance of his eye. "What name is that, or what do you say it is?" he asked when I paused. "I decline to tell you." And with that I turned on my heel and walked to the back door. Again the bell was rung, and the two men entered. "Detain the prisoner in the ante room," cried von Augener peremptorily, "and send the chief of the police to me at once. I'll find a way to make you talk," he added angrily to me. I was led out into the ante room, and the men mounted guard over me, the rest of those present, who were lolling and chatting idly, staring at me with some curiosity. I cared nothing. My temper was still excited, and my pulses throbbing with anger, as I sat, paying scant heed to what went on around me. Suddenly there came a change. Every man in the room leapt to his feet and stood rigid at attention. A strong, firm, somewhat harsh voice was heard, which I knew well, and like the rest, I rose instinctively as I saw the Emperor enter the room, followed by two officers of his suite. A single, hurried, sweeping glance of his appeared to notice everything in the place, and after a rapid, lightning look in my direction, the eyes dwelling on my face for 1 second, he passed through the door and entered the room which I had just left. When I resumed my seat, my heart was beating fast, no longer with anger against von Augener, but with the thought of meeting again under such altered circumstances the powerful and remarkable monarch who, as a prince, had been my intimate companion. I hoped and more than half believed that he had come so that he might be present at my examination. I guessed he would have been told the hour fixed for it, and let the risks be what they might, I resolved that the opportunity should not pass, if I could possibly help it, without my obtaining an audience. I would put everything on the hazard in order to lay before him directly the true story of the plot from Minna's point of view, and I would back my statement with an avowal of my identity. A quarter of an hour later the door was opened again, and how anxiously I had kept my eyes glued to it may be imagined, and I was ordered to return alone into the room. My excitement, as I rose to obey, was so intense and unnerving that it was all I could do to command myself sufficiently to be able to walk steadily into the presence. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 28. The Emperor. When I entered the room the second time, old von Augener was still sitting at the table, and the Emperor was standing at one of the windows, his stern, strong profile showing to me clear-cut and hard against the light. I halted just inside the door, and stood gazing at him. I was in a sense half fascinated by the crowd of emotions which his presence roused. To me he was still what he had always been, the type of much that is best and highest in mankind, while his actual greatness and nobility were magnified many times by the glamour of my old personal affection for him. Had he known who I was, what, I wondered, would have been the manner of my reception? As I entered the room the two members of the suite left it, and we three, the Emperor, von Augener, and I, were left alone. Ignorant though the harsh old man was of my identity, yet the hate and hostility which he had felt for me originally appeared to motive him now, for he scowled to the full as angrily as on that day when he had come to my cabin to pass the virtual sentence of death upon me. "Now," he called suddenly with a sharp, rasping jerk of his voice, for he saw that my eyes were fixed on the Emperor, "stand here, if you please," and he pointed to a spot in front of his table. "You refused to speak a few minutes since, and to tell me what you know of this matter. Perhaps you will do so now, since his Majesty has graciously vouchsafed to give you another chance." The harshness of his manner did more than anything else could have done to collect my somewhat scrambled wits. I did not refuse to say what I knew. I refused to submit to insinuations that were insulting to me. I told you that if you would question me without insult, I would reply. I am only too anxious to make known every fact in my possession, and it was my intention to solicit an audience of his Majesty for that purpose. The old bully listened with very ill grace to this, and would have frowned me down had he dared, but I was not to be stopped by him. "You have told me how you went to Gramberg, and you allege that you remained there to protect the Countess Minna from a plot against her. How came you as a stranger to know anything about such a plot?" "I was told that the Count von Nauheim was the acknowledged representative of a powerful section of the Gramberg supporters here in Munich, and that it was a part of the compact that he should have the Countess as his wife, the alleged reason being the desire to secure to that section a direct share of the influence which the throne would naturally wield. As I knew that the Count was already married, and a man of the vilest and most infamous character, the inference of treachery lay on the surface." "The inference might affect the man himself, but how do you know that others were aware of his character?" "The fact itself was a sufficient motive to induce me to try and save the girl from such a man. The proofs that others were concerned with him came afterwards and gradually." "What proofs?" "That von Nauheim, at the instigation of others, had virtually murdered the Countess Minna's brother at the moment when a former plot was rife to carry the throne and put the Count Gustav upon it. The murder was in this wise," and I told the story of Praga's duel. As I spoke, unfolding the story gradually and with such a skill as I had at command, I saw the face by the window growing darker and gloomier and sterner every minute. "There is a nest of vermin here that needs clearing out," exclaimed von Augener at the close. "How do you know all this?" "From Praga himself, who extorted the confession of the whole plot from von Nauheim both in writing and afterward in the presence of the Countess Minna and myself. Praga was himself attacked in turn by the agents of these men, because he had refused to do what they wished, to murder me. By a lucky stroke of fortune, it was I who chanced to come to his help." "What attempts have been made on you, and in your opinion why?" For answer I described the means by which I had at the meeting managed to make my life necessary for the carrying on of their scheme. "There was a plot within a plot," I said. "An open plot, of which the securing of the crown for the Countess Minna was the object ostensibly, and a secret one which aimed at her ruin, to make her unfit to become queen by mating her with a man already married, or to ruin her by putting her into his power for an object infinitely more foul and vile. It was against that I had to fight, and to fight almost single-handed," and I went on to describe at length many of the incidents of the past few weeks. "Why did you not come to Berlin, sir?" The question came from the Emperor, who wheeled around on me as if clinching an accusation, while he stared fixedly at me, those searching, piercing, wonderful eyes of his boring into my head. "You would have spared us all this trouble." "I should have spared myself also the humiliation of having no sufficient answer to your Majesty's question," was my reply. "I see it now. My motive was that I feared the enmity of the Ostenburg family would reach the Countess Minna wherever she might be. I was told, and believed that indeed, that they would suffer no Gramberg rival for the throne to remain alive and at liberty. I knew that they had compassed the death of the brother, and had plotted a dishonor worse than death against the Countess herself, and I believed there were no limits to their venom and hostility." "But how could you hope to save her by allowing things to go on?" he asked again after a pause, in the same sharp, indicting tone. "I thought I had devised a scheme by which I could put the Countess in a position of such strength that she could dictate virtually her own terms, and so secure that liberty which I feared they would never otherwise concede. My plan was to allow the conspiracy to go forward for putting the Countess upon the throne, to postpone the marriage with von Nauheim, and then to watch for and thwart the attempt I knew would be made to get her into their power, and at the same time to deliver a counter-blow and to get the Ostenburg heir, the Duke Marx, into my own hands. I calculated that then I could make my own terms in the Countess's interests." "For heaven, sir, you don't lack daring to play fast and loose with thrones in this way," cried von Augener, while the Emperor stood sternly silent, revolving what I had said. "Tell me the rest," he said abruptly. "My scheme broke in my hands because I was myself betrayed to them. The Baron Heckscher succeeded in gaining information of my plans, or rather of that part of them which I had made for the safe keeping of the Countess, and he outwitted me at the last moment." And I described the whole ruse by which Minna had been carried off at the ball and Clara Weylin put in her place. The story was interesting enough to them, and both listened closely. When I ended, von Augener bent to read some of the papers on his desk, in order, as I saw, to compare what I had told him with what had been previously reported to him. But the Kaiser needed no notes. That extraordinary memory of his carried every detail, item, and particular, and as I was telling him my version, he was comparing it link for link with what he already knew, in a process of subtle mental analysis. "And your next step?" he asked sharply after a short pause. "To make my possession of the Duke Marx perfectly secure, and then to warn Baron Heckscher that I held the Duke as a hostage for the safety of the Countess." "Do you mean to admit that you openly threatened to use violence on the person of the Duke, the heir to the throne?" asked von Augener, as if aghast at my temerity in venturing on such a confession. "I threatened it, and I meant it, too," I replied in a voice firm enough to prove that I was in earnest. "You can see the heinousness of that offence?" "It was not a tenth part so bad as the offences of the Ostenburg party. They had actually murdered one heir and threatened another. I had chosen a course and was compelled to carry it out my own way. But I knew the Baron would never drive me to an extreme step of that kind. While I held the Duke in pawn, the Baron was helpless and had no option but to yield to me. And this I made him understand." And with that I gave them a full report of my last interview with Baron Heckscher, and of the compact we then made, that Minna should be given up to me, and the Duke Marx set at liberty, the condition being that the former should go away, and leave the latter at liberty to come forward when called to the throne, and that there should be a subsequent definite renunciation by Minna of all claim to the crown. "A pretty ring of kingmakers, indeed!" exclaimed von Augener. "And that compact, as you term it, was carried out?" asked the Emperor. "Yes, sire. But everything was jeopardized at the 11th hour by the villainy of the man von Nauheim, who made a bold effort to break away with the Countess, having as his confederate her aunt, the Baroness Gratz." "You scatter your charges with a free hand, young man. Every one appears to be a rogue but yourself," ejaculated von Augener, whose malice apparently prompted him to see and put my conduct in the worst light. The Emperor lifted a protesting hand, however. "Tell your tale," he said, addressing me curtly. "Every word I say can be tested by independent inquiry," I answered. "These people are accused not by my words, but by their own acts." I described then my journey to Landsberg and what had happened there, though I said nothing of the love scenes. "And by that time, I suppose, you thought you had done enough to warrant you in running off with the Countess herself?" said old von Augener. I made no reply, but kept my face as though he had not spoken. "How came you to attempt to fly the country?" asked the Emperor. "I was not attempting to fly the country, sire," I replied readily. "I had told the Countess of the interview with Baron Heckscher, and my advice to her was that she should put the frontier between her and the enemies who had betrayed and persecuted her with such virulence. I was taking her to Charmes, to the care of the man in whose place I stood, Herr von Fromberg, now known as Monsieur Henri Frombe, and I had told her that I should immediately return either here or to Berlin to lay her case before your Majesty, that her interests might be secured and herself protected from further violence." "But you kept up your personation of the Prince?" cried von Augener, seeing another point to be scored against me. I deemed that a necessary step until all could be explained. The Countess was left at Landsberg without a friend to whom she could turn. The Baroness Gratz, who should have protected her, had first betrayed her to Baron Heckscher, and then connived at von Nauheim stealing away with her from Landsberg. What then was I to do? I had explained to her that I was not the Prince, and it seemed that my only possible course was to take her to where she would at least be in the care of a relative, and, as I judged, safe. What else should I have done? "Is that all you have to say of your part in the plot?" The question came from the Emperor as sharply as a pistol shot. "I think I have told your Majesty everything of my share in it." "You haven't told us what you hoped to gain by your work," said the vindictive old man, ruthless in his desire to injure me. "But I suppose it's no use to ask that," he added, this with a shrug of the shoulders, as if to suggest that I was no better than a paltry, unreliable rascal, who would tell any tale and any lie to serve his own ends. I let the sneer pass unheeded. "Could you form any opinion of the state of feeling in Munich or in the kingdom?" was the Emperor's next question. "I know but little of either Munich or Bavaria, sire. The men I came in contact with were certainly men of influence, and as certainly were moved by feelings of deep resentment against the conduct of the King, his extravagance in particular. But I was planning for the Countess Minna's safety, and not probing Bavarian politics." The Kaiser's face gave no indication of the impression which my words created, and after a moment's thought he dismissed that part of the matter with the sentence, and turned to another. "You will write out a list of all the men whom you met. And now, what of the Countess Minna? Speak as plainly of her part as you have of your own." The last words were welcome indeed. Like the wave of a brush, they wiped out the sneers of von Augener, and showed me they had produced no effect. "I thank you, sire," I answered, my pulse quickening. "The Countess has had no part or lot in all this, save that of passive acquiescence in my suggestions. She was against the scheme when her brother was the claimant for the throne, she remained hostile to it when he had been killed, and when the Prince, her father, died, she was resolute never under any circumstances to consent to take the crown. It was only the knowledge that her own personal safety was imperilled, and the belief that by this apparent agreement with the scheme she could best secure that safety, which induced her to consent, to even appear to consent, to any such plot being carried on in her name. For that belief I myself accept the responsibility. She left it to me to select the best road to safety, and she is as innocent as an unborn babe of even an intention to conspire against the King." "You have taken a grave responsibility," he said sternly. "And I trust your Majesty will visit on me alone the consequences," I answered earnestly. This unfortunate girl had scarcely any one around her but those who were plotting to betray her, and it will be a strange irony if I, who at least was loyal to her, have brought her under the heavy lash of your Majesty's displeasure. I spoke with warm feeling, and went on to put such reasons as my fear and love for Minna prompted, why any penalty for what had been done should fall on me. And as I spoke I watched the Emperor with eager, hungry keenness for some sign that my pleading was likely to prevail. But not a feature was relaxed for an instant. Not a sign or token did he give of feeling. The face retained the same set, impassive, inflexible, gloomy sternness which he had maintained throughout. He heard me to the end, but made no response or reply. There remaining then but one thing more for me to say, one more avowal to make, and I thought of it with something like foreboding. He seemed so cold, so unimpressionable, so infinitely removed from me, that I could not bring myself to hope that any good would result from my declaring my identity. There appeared no chords of old friendship, no associations of comradeship to reawaken. But there was at least the chance that it would convince him that I had spoken the truth. He appeared to me as the type and embodiment of cold, rarefied, unemotional intellectuality, judgment founded on justice but feelingless, mind not heart, the very presentment of retributive righteousness without the warmth of charity. A man who had accepted the high mission of his rulership in a spirit of unshakable faith in the heavenly character of the mission, but who in accepting it had bound down with the iron clamps of an implacable will the milder attributes which go to make humanity human. Who was to say what would be the effect of an avowal like mine which, like a sudden sword thrust, might pierce for once his armor of inflexibility and set flowing again the blood of his older nature? It was he who touched the subject first, and in the form which I had anticipated. He broke a long pause to say: "You have spoken freely enough, but what is the guarantee of your truth?" I paused an instant, and looking him straight in the face, I answered, with slow emphasis: "I have never told your Majesty a lie in my life." The unexpected character of the reply set him thinking, and he fixed his eyes on mine. "What do you mean by that? Who are you, and what was your real motive in this?" Von Augener was also staring hard at me, and I could see that both were thinking hard in the effort to solve the puzzle I had evidently set them. I let a minute pass without a word, and then said in a low voice: "I am a man who for years has been under a ban, condemned to live an empty, useless, purposeless life. I saw in this affair at once a means of helping a helpless girl who was sorely beset by dangers. I longed for some sphere of activity for myself again, and I hoped that possibly I might even achieve an object that is never out of my thoughts." I found myself speaking for the first time with nervousness and hesitation, and I faltered and then stopped. The Emperor made no reply, but kept his eyes fixed piercingly on my face. Old von Augener sneered. "We are getting to the truth now, I suppose." The sneer was just the tonic I needed. I found my voice again, and went on in the same low tone. "For years I have been one of the most pitiable and remorseful of your Majesty's subjects, and I was fighting in this thing in the vague hope that it might possibly in some means enable me to regain part of my old character." I thought I could detect a faint symptom of concern on the tense, set face turned full on me, just a momentary dilation of the nostrils, but it passed before my pause ended, and in quite as brief, stern a tone as he had before used, he asked: "Who are you?" I took heart, and tried to brace myself for the final effort. "Your Majesty, One day some years ago in one of the upper reaches of the Elbe, where the current was known to be fierce and dangerous, two lads, who had stolen away from their companions, were bathing alone. The river was flooded and swollen, and the stream more than commonly perilous to the swimmers. It proved too powerful for one of them, and he gave a cry and sank. His friend, for they were close friends then, himself struggling hard with the stream, was ahead and had nearly reached the bank, but turned back and dived for his friend, and under the mercy of God was the means of saving his life. I stopped. The Emperor was staring at me with a look of such intentness as I have never seen on any human face before or since. He had drawn himself to his full height, and every muscle of his sinewy, powerful, tireless frame was at full tension, while his breath was labored and came and went through his dilated nostrils as though the passing of it were a pain. But he made no answer. One of the lads, sire, the one whose life was in danger, was the future ruler of the mighty German Empire. The other— I paused again, and then suddenly threw myself on one knee before him— was your Majesty's most miserable subject, the Count Karl von Rudloff, whose shameful, violent deed against you later has now been punished by 5 years of bitter remorse and hopeless solitude. I am that unhappiest of men." "Von Rudloff!" cried the Emperor, now in amazement, while the older man sprang to his feet, and both stood looking down at me in unbounded astonishment. Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 29. Count von Rudloff. The effect of my announcement was supreme. I myself was deeply affected, and in the moments of critical silence during which the Emperor and his old confidential adviser stood gazing at me, I could not raise my head to meet their looks. The Kaiser was the first to speak. "You have amazed me. I know you now, but I did not. What was the meaning of your pretended death? Rise, I do not wish you to kneel to me." There seemed a little hope in the last sentence. I got up slowly. "It was not premeditated, sire. I gave my word to Count von Augener here—" "Stay!" interposed the Kaiser quickly, turning a frowning face to his adviser. "What is this?" "I should prefer to discuss these matters in private with your Majesty," was the answer, not without what appeared to me to be some anxiety. "Would you prefer to retire at once?" "As your Majesty pleases." This reply was given with great reluctance. "Be it so, then." And the old man went away, giving me a glance of hate as he passed. I did not understand the meaning of this development, and stood waiting in silence for the imperial command to speak. The silence lengthened itself into minutes, and when I ventured to glance at the Kaiser, I was disconcerted to find he was staring at me fixedly, and, as it seemed, very sternly. But there were certain symptoms of unrest and agitation that made me believe that he was forcing himself rather to repress every trace of the feelings I had roused. When at length he spoke, his voice had a depth and a vibration which told me, who knew him so well, how strongly he was moved. "Why have you done this? Why deceive me with the gorgeous lie of your death and funeral? Why never declare yourself till now?" There was much more reproach than anger in the tone, and I began to hope again. "May I tell your Majesty plainly all that occurred? When that mad thing happened on the yacht, a madness that will be an ever pressing grief and shame to me to my dying hour, I went out feeling that only death at my own hands could wipe out the disgrace of it. I should have killed myself that night but for the reflection that my death might come to be publicly associated with what had happened. Then the next day Count von Augener came and told me that unless I was dead within a week my death would be an infamous one. The threat was unneeded, sire. That day I went to Berlin to Dr. Mein—" and I went on to give him a succinct account of all the circumstances by which the old doctor had led me to believe that I was dying, and had played out the drama of my funeral while I lay in his house unconscious. "I set out from Berlin," I continued, "to make the career which the old man had spoken of, and my first effort was on the stage. There I learned the secret of disguise, and became what you see me, to all intents and purposes another man in appearance. A little more than a year ago the doctor died, and left me his large fortune, and I was once again set roaming, alive, but without a life to live, when I was carried, against my will and in spite of my protests, to Gramberg, and plunged into the seething cauldron of intrigue there. The rest your Majesty knows, and it remains only for me to say that the one wild hope I had in carrying this intrigue forward was that I might perhaps so control the position here in Munich as to prove myself of service to you, sire, and be able to plead it as a ground for your pardon." His Majesty had made no comment during the whole narrative, and now he stood for some moments without making a reply. He stared steadfastly at me the whole time, with an expression of sombre, stern melancholy. When he spoke at length, it was in the firm, quick, decisive tone which he used when his mind was made up and his course chosen. "I accept your story absolutely, for I believe you incapable of intentional deceit toward me. So far as the Countess Minna is concerned, it will be my personal care to see that she is righted and her enemies thwarted." He ceased as abruptly as he had spoken. "May I thank you—" I began. "You have no right to speak for her," he interrupted shortly. I took the rebuff in silence, and stood wondering what he would say as to my own affairs. There came another long, trying pause. "You did wrong, very wrong," he burst out, with sudden vehemence, speaking almost passionately. "I have been badly served in your matters. You were no more to blame than I myself, and you have made me bear for 5 years the secret fear that I drove you to your death, and I have cares enough without that." He stopped, and I looked up as if to speak, but he silenced me with a gesture, and the grandeur of his dignity awed me. I recognized the supremely unselfish magnanimity of his act, and I longed to put my feelings into words, but I fell back abashed and speechless before the sense of intense power and majesty which surrounded him like a subtle, magnetic force. He stood buried in thought, wholly self-absorbed for some minutes, and then in the same abrupt manner broke the silence to dismiss me. "Leave me now, and remain in the ante-room. I will see you later or send you my decision as to yourself." I backed to the door, bowing, and had all but reached it in silence when a hasty movement of his caused me to look up. "Stay!" he cried, and he came toward me with his quick, firm stride. "I cannot let you go like this. I am glad you are living. You come back to me out of the past that is, and must be, dead, and our friendship is one of the dead things in it. An emperor has no friend but his God. Still we were friends once, and this is our more proper parting." He held out his hand to me and took mine and clasped it, and at the clasp of it my blood thrilled in accord with 1,000 thoughts and promptings. I carried his hand to my lips. "If your Majesty will give me a chance of serving you again in any capacity, my life shall be ever at your bidding." I spoke from my heart, and my voice trembled under the strain of my feelings. "I believe you, but you yourself have made it difficult. Save for that, what might we not have been?" There was no sternness or harshness in this. It was not my Emperor who spoke, but for one fleeting instant it was the personal lament of my old true friend, whose friendship I had cast away. The words brought the tears to my eyes, and I could not look up at him, though I knew his eyes were bent upon me, and judged that their light was a kindly one. A moment later the mood passed with him, or was crushed back by the relentless power of his stern will. He drew himself up to his customary, rigid, soldier-like attitude, and said in the short, sharp tone of a military command: "And now leave me." I backed out, and took my place in the ante-room, a prey to a tumultuous rush of emotions which flooded upon me, preventing for the moment any attempt at consecutive thought. My mind was a maelstrom in which hopes, regrets, fear and delight were mingled in an indistinguishable whirlpool. Presently, out of the roar and rush of inchoate emotions, 3 thoughts began to dominate me. Regret, bitter, maddening, and unavailing, for the years I had lost and the career I had thrown away. Wrath, wild and vengeful, against the old enemy of my family, von Augener, for the treachery of his action toward me, and delight, infinitely sweet, that Minna's safety was secured, and that, after all, it was I who had secured it. The last outweighed the others, and I lost myself in the maze of a love reverie as I sat there, picturing the joy that would leap from her eyes, and the light that would gladden her beautiful face, if only I could be the messenger of the good news. And it was to be so. After I had waited I know not how long, for time goes unmeasured in love dreams, some one came and addressed me by a name that made me jump to my feet and stare at the messenger like one half beside himself. Count von Rudloff. It was one of the 2 members of the suite I had seen with the Emperor before my interview with him. "You are addressing me, sir?" I asked. "I am addressing the Count von Rudloff," he answered, with that air of impassive coolness that men of his kind affect. I made an effort to regain my self-possession and to answer him with the same measured calmness. "I am the Count von Rudloff," I said. "I bring you a letter from the Emperor, Count." He waited while I tore it open with fingers that trembled. It was short and peremptory enough, but what did it not mean to me? "I have decided to restore you to your title and possessions. The question of your future career remains in abeyance for the present." That was all, with the signature of the Emperor himself. "May I be the first to offer a word of congratulation, Count?" asked the messenger. Thank you," I murmured. "It is all unexpected." He still waited, and I thought there might be something more to add. "Is there anything more to add?" I asked. "His Majesty suggests that you should travel for a time, a year or so, perhaps, so that the manner of your return to Berlin and your resumption of your position may not seem to come as the result of this business here in Munich." "I understand," I said, though I still seemed in a dream. "And am I free to go where I please now?" "Certainly," he returned, smiling. "Can I be of any assistance?" "No, thank you, no. I have some urgent business that will not wait another second." A minute after that I had left the palace and was hurrying as fast as horses could drag me to Minna to tell her the brilliant news. Chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 30. The End. When I reached Minna's house, I had an experience that at first amused me. I could not, of course, any longer treat the house as my own, nor look on myself as having any right to enter, and I found the servants very reluctant to admit me at all, and it was only after some difficulty that I succeeded in getting shown into a room close to the door, while they said they would carry my message. I waited in some little fever of impatience, and when the delay had grown into minutes I began to wonder that Minna should take so coolly the fact of my return and the news she must know I should carry. I saw the explanation, however, when the door was opened and the Baroness Gratz sailed in, pompous and very angry. "What can be your business here now?" she asked, staring at me through her eyeglass. "I have come to see Minna," I replied, with an inclination to smile at her conduct. "I am astounded that you should have the assurance to come here after your egregious imposture. Of course you do not expect to see her." "Indeed I do," I said quickly, "and as soon as possible." "And pray in what character now?" This with a contemptuous and insulting curl of the lip. I paused to give my reply the greater emphasis. "In a double character, a messenger from his Majesty the Emperor, and as her affianced husband." "You are not her affianced husband, and I will not suffer that tale to be told in my presence. As for the rest, it is more like a play actor's story. You imposed upon us too long. You will not do it again." She said this very angrily indeed, and added almost spitefully, "The Countess does not wish to see you." "In this case I am afraid she cannot choose," I answered. "The Emperor's business cannot wait upon any prejudices for or against his messengers." There was a little stretch of authority insinuated in this. Moreover, I am bound to say that I prefer to have her decision straight from herself. "You suggest that I lie, suppose?" she cried, her eyes flashing. "You are too brave a man not to seize a chance of insulting a defenseless woman. That is your stage chivalry. But you will find I am not so defenseless as you suppose." She rang the bell sharply twice, and then, somewhat to my surprise, and a good deal to my pleasure, the Baron Heckscher was shown in. "I am told you wish to see me, Baroness," he said, ignoring my presence. I wish you to tell this person what we have decided as to his prosecution." I swung around on him instantly. "I am glad there is a man to deal with. How dare you presume to meddle in my affairs, Baron Heckscher?" "Really? But how shall I call you? Not the Prince any longer, I presume. Then what?" And he regarded me with an insolent smile. "His Majesty the Emperor within the last few minutes has been good enough to call me by my own name, the Count von Rudloff. That may be a precedent good enough for even you to follow." He stared at me in blank astonishment. The fact that I had been closeted with the Emperor might mean everything to him, and at the thought all other considerations were dwarfed. I enjoyed his discomfiture. All his insolence disappeared. "You do not believe what he says, surely?" cried the vindictive old lady when he made no immediate answer, for he stood in great perplexity what course to take toward me. "You will see you cannot remain here in the face of the Baroness's attitude," he said to me at length, with an air that was half truculent and half deprecatory. I laughed. "I see you are vastly disconcerted to hear that I have had an audience with his Majesty, and have left him under circumstances that augur ill for you, and well you may be," I added meaningly. "You dare to meddle in my matters at a time when you will need all your wits to save your own from shipwreck. But I have had enough of you, and of this folly. I now demand in the name of the Emperor to see the Countess Minna von Gramberg, and if you attempt to stop me," I said sternly to the Baroness Gratz, "the consequences may be far more grave than you think." Her anger and dislike of me gave her plenty of courage, however, and she still set me at defiance, abusing me for an impostor and a cheat, and when I declared that if they did not take my message to Minna, I would myself go straight to her rooms, she planted herself in front of the door and dared me to attempt to leave it for that purpose, and vowed she would call the servants if I would not go away. The situation began to verge upon the ridiculous, despite the fact that it was in a measure embarrassing. I could not for the moment see what to do, and was debating this in my thoughts when a sudden turn was given to matters by the entrance of Minna herself, the door being opened from without. "Ah, Minna!" I cried, hastening to her. The Baroness Gratz stepped in between us, however, and lifted her hand as to keep me away. "The Countess is here in my charge," she cried to me, "and while that is so I forbid you to go near her." But love laughs at prohibitions. A moment later we were hand-locked, and she had read in my glad face that my news was good. Then she turned angrily upon the Baroness, her face flushed and her eyes shining. "You have no right to interfere with me," she said, her words shortly and sharply spoken. "I have just heard, to my intense indignation, that you have even ventured to tell my servants who shall and who shall not enter my house. Is this true?" "So far as it relates to this person, of course it is true. You are in my charge, and it is my duty—" "You have mistaken your duty and overstepped your privileges. You have no right to give such orders, and to do it in my name. You must have known as well as I that the last man in the world against whom my door would ever be shut would be my affianced husband." And she raised her head and stood very erect, looking rarely beautiful in her pride and happiness. "I did it to save you from the wiles of an adventurer who—" "Silence, Aunt Gratz, and shame to you for those words!" cried Minna hotly. It was this adventurer, as you dared to say, who saved me from the hands of the villain whose schemes you helped, and from the cowardly double plot of the Baron Heckscher there. As for you, sir, if you knew the character of your puppet and tool von Nauheim, as I firmly believe you did," she cried to Baron Heckscher, "there are no words bad enough to paint the infamous vileness of your treachery. While pretending to conspire in my interest, and while professing loyalty to me and mine, you plotted to ruin and dishonor me, and when I find you here today I can only believe you have some further abominable motive or plot against me, and that you are here to suborn some of those about me for your purposes. Be good enough to leave the house." "I have come to protest to you," he began in reply. "I decline to listen to you, sir," she interrupted, with quiet dignity. He stood a moment scowling viciously, and then, with an ugly glance at me, said: "Your nameless friend here—" "I have already told you," I broke in angrily, "that I am the Count von Rudloff, and that the Emperor himself has addressed me in my name." "I have known for some time all the facts as to this," added Minna, a swift flash from her eyes telling me her delight at the news, "and of the load of infinite obligation I owe to the Count von Rudloff, not the least part of it is for the defeat and exposure of your schemes against me. Be good enough to spare me the necessity of bidding my servants expel you from the house." "You had better go, Baron," I put in. "You will probably find at your house by this time a summons to the Emperor's presence, for he has heard from me the whole story of your acts." This statement completed his disquiet, and without another word he hurried away. "You will be troubled by him no more, Minna," I said. "I bring you the best of news. The Emperor has given a personal pledge to answer for your safety and to uphold your interests." "The Emperor!" she cried in a tone of surprise. "More than that. I have told him all, and he has acknowledged my title." And I showed her the imperial letter. Her face shone with pride and delight. "I can forgive every one now, for it has all ended so splendidly for you," she said. "For us," I corrected, and she acknowledged the correction with a blush and a smile of love which exasperated the Baroness Gratz, who had been listening to us in indignant silence. "Then I suppose you have no more use for me," she declared, with an angry toss of the head, as she turned to leave us. "I am afraid you yourself have made it difficult for you to share in my happiness, in our happiness, I mean," said Minna gently. "I am so happy that I have no room for any thought on that score, but regret that it should be so." "You were always an ungrateful girl, Minna," replied the old lady very ungraciously, bitter to the end against me. "And I have no wish to share with you or deprive you of any part of such happiness as you may expect to find in company with a man who is sometimes play actor, sometimes prince, and always an impostor." And with that parting taunt she flung away. "Poor Aunt Gratz," sighed Minna. Then she put her hands in mine, and nestling close to me, asked with a winsome coquettishness: "Am I ungrateful, Karl?" My answer may be guessed, and it took long in telling. But we returned after a time to the ways of common sense, and then I told her what had passed during the audience with the Kaiser, that I was to travel for a year, and then return to Berlin to take up formally my old title and position. At first the news brought a cloud to her happy face. "A year is a long time, Karl. she murmured. "Shall you never be in either Munich or Gramberg all that time?" "I think not. I expect it means at least a year away from the fatherland." She was silent and looked almost sad. "But a year will soon pass," I whispered. A gesture of pretty reproach answered me. "If you would make a little sacrifice, it would help, I think." "Sacrifice!" she echoed, not catching my meaning. And when I did not reply, she lifted her head from my shoulder and peered into my eyes, her own full of curiosity. "You used to pride yourself on reading my secrets," said I. She thought a minute, then a look of wonderment shone in her eyes, followed almost directly by a great, glad blush that spread all over her face, dyeing her cheeks with crimson and driving her to hide them against my shoulder. "I don't guess this one," she said. But I was sure she had. "Don't?" "Won't, then," she murmured into my coat lapel. "It could not be yet, of course," said I. "But in 3 months—" "You said sacrifice," she interrupted, and glanced up with a quick darting of the eyes. "It would have to be very quiet. Very, very quiet." "It is no sacrifice to travel in company." And there we left it, but we knew well enough each other's hopes and desires. To accomplish our purpose called for some little tact and effort, because the Emperor was for having Minna taken to Berlin when the Munich troubles had been arranged. His prompt and drastic measures soon settled these indeed. An official announcement was made that the King had been suffering from an indisposition, but had happily recovered completely, and a couple of days later saw him back at the palace, but with a change in the executive which was calculated to work vastly beneficial results for the country. The Heckscher party was broken up, their influence destroyed, and their leaders dealt with secretly, but in some cases none the less severely. The question of the succession to the throne was settled upon a sound basis, one of the points being the renunciation by Minna of all the Gramberg claims. And it was in settling this that the matter of her marriage was mooted, and the imperial consent gained to her becoming my wife. We succeeded, too, in getting the necessary interval fixed at 3 months. The time passed very pleasantly. It was the sweetest preface to a lifelong romance. As the outcome of the dash we had made for the throne, I had one or two arrangements to complete, and in some respects the most difficult of these was in regard to the Corsican Praga. I could not retain him in my service because of his association with the death of Minna's brother, while I hoped, too, that the time would never recur when I might have need for his clever, sharp, ready sword. I told him the case plainly, and he was too careless to make demur. He was going to marry and settle in Berlin, he assured me. His bride was to be the actress, Clara Weylin, who had made her peace with him in the score of her act of treachery, and he meant to be the greatest fencing master in Berlin, he declared. I gave him as a wedding present a considerable sum of money, and we parted with many assurances, characteristic and voluble on his part, that he would ever be devoted to me and my interests. Steinitz I kept with me as secretary, and von Krugen was to remain as guardian of our interests at Gramberg. There was one commission we gave to the two just before our marriage. to go to Charmes and endeavour to bring the real von Fromberg to Munich to be present at the marriage. Minna and I were together when they started, and she was looking more radiant and beautiful than ever in the anticipative joy of the marriage. I gave them full instructions, and then, with a smile, I turned to von Krugen. "Be more careful this time," I said, "and be sure you bring the right man." "I could not have brought a better man last time, Count," he replied. And in the tone and earnestness spoke all the regard and esteem of a stanch and sincere friend. "What do you say to that, Minna?" I asked as they drove off. "A happier mistake was never made, but I don't want him to do it again. The only throne I care for is won now." And reaching up on tiptoe, she put her face to mine for a tribute of my loyalty, and I paid it willingly. The End. End of Chapter 30. End of A Dash for a Throne by Arthur W. Marchmont. Recorded by Carolyn in January and February 2013 in Oldenburg, Germany. Thanks for listening.